Nous allons maintenant vous présenter un couple qui avait tout pour être heureux. Carole Head et Benoît Philippins s'étaient rencontrés au travail, à la banque, avant de tomber amoureux et de se marier. Un conte de fées moderne qui s'est brutalement achevé dans le sang un soir d'avril 2014. Tous deux ont été abattus devant chez eux en rentrant d'un dîner. À ce double meurtre s'ajoute celui d'Esteban, 9 ans, le filleul de Carole, le fils d'une de ses amies qui les accompagnait ce soir-là. Mais qui pouvait bien leur en vouloir à ce point? C'est un document signé Héloïse Fagard.
Ce soir d'avril 2014, à Visé, au nord-est de la Belgique, un couple va bientôt mourir. Carole Head et Benoît Philippins rentrent d'un dîner entre amis. Avec eux dans la voiture, le petit Esteban, 9 ans, le filleul de Carole. C'est la première fois qu'il est autorisé à dormir chez sa marraine. Et terrible coïncidence, c'est exactement ce soir-là qu'un mystérieux individu a décidé de s'en prendre à Benoît et Carole.
Il stationne la voiture dans l'allée de la maison. Là, ils sortent tranquillement après une bonne soirée. Et puis là, il y a quelqu'un qui les attend, tapis dans l'ombre.
Sandrine Sinov venait de passer la soirée avec le couple Philippins. Elle est la dernière personne à les avoir vus en vie.
On était avec eux juste avant. On n'a rien vu au restaurant, on fait rien de suspect. Voilà, le monde s'écroule, quoi. Et puis il y avait Esteban, donc on se dit un enfant aussi là-dedans, c'est encore... qui ose faire ça, un enfant?
Voici l'histoire d'un jeune garçon qui va se trouver au mauvais endroit, au mauvais moment. Et d'un couple qui s'était fait beaucoup d'ennemis, au point que l'un d'eux décide de les tuer.
Ça nous fait quand même penser à une exécution.
C'est pas possible. Dans les films, oui, mais en réalité, on ne prend pas la vie de 3 personnes, dont un enfant, pour du fric.
Ça ressemble donc à tous les signes, 1, de la culpabilité et 2, de la préméditation.
On veut le faire passer pour un monstre et il ne l'est pas.
Ce vendredi 18 avril 2014, l'inspecteur Viola était justement en patrouille dans la ville lorsque vers 22h15, il est appelé sur les lieux de la fusillade. Cette intervention, le policier n'est pas prêt de l'oublier.
Quand on arrive sur place, on prend toutes les précautions d'usage, à savoir progresser tactiquement vers le lieu des faits, c'est-à-dire arme au poing, puisqu'on nous signale comme des blessés par balle et on ne sait pas si l'auteur est toujours sur place.
En fait, le tireur a déjà pris la fuite et laissé derrière lui un vrai carnage.
Juste à côté du véhicule, 3 corps sont allongés.
3 victimes sur quelques mètres, des douilles, énormément de sang. Pour moi, c'était une scène de guerre. J'aperçois immédiatement le corps, un premier corps, qui est le corps d'un enfant. Vu l'ampleur des blessures, la seule chose que je fais, c'est poser ma main sur lui et lui dire que les secours arrivent et qu'on est là.
Après quelques minutes qui semblent une éternité, les ambulanciers prennent en charge Esteban. Le petit garçon est touché à la tête. Il a perdu beaucoup de sang.
On essaye de récupérer un pouls. On fait tout ce qu'on peut à ce moment-là.
Malheureusement pour le petit garçon, on voit bien que son état est absolument désespéré et on ne pourra rien faire pour le sauver.
L'enfant décède sous les yeux impuissants des secouristes et des policiers. Mais pour Carole Head et son époux Benoît Philippins, il n'est peut-être pas encore trop tard.
La dame, elle est en état de choc, mais elle est encore consciente. Elle crie qu'elle a mal, elle crie qu'elle a peur.
Elle est blessée au dos. Ça se voit de par sa position.
Pourtant, Carole va puiser dans ses dernières forces pour faire aux policiers une révélation capitale. En effet, elle a clairement entendu ce que le tireur a dit à son époux Benoît juste avant d'ouvrir le feu.
Elle me dit donc il est arrivé près de mon mari, et il lui a dit tu me reconnais, et ensuite il a tiré.
Ce qui induit la question suivante du policier à Carole. Et vous, est-ce que vous l'avez reconnu? Est-ce que vous le connaissiez? Et elle répondra non.
Benoît Philippins est donc le seul à connaître l'identité du tireur, mais il est impossible de l'interroger.
Au moment où les ambulanciers vont le prendre en charge, il est déjà inconscient. Il est quasiment en état de mort cérébrale. Il va décéder dans l'ambulance. Alors que Carole, elle, va arriver encore vivante.
Et on va aller jusqu'à la salle d'opération et la table d'opération, et on va encore une fois, pendant plusieurs heures, essayer de la sauver avant que malheureusement elle ne décède sur la table d'opération dans le courant de la nuit.
Christian, le père de Carole Head, n'oubliera jamais cette nuit où il a été réveillé en sursaut par un policier.
On frappe à la porte et il y a un gars là qui me dit « Vous êtes bien le papa de Carole Head ?» Ben, je dis « Oui, parce que votre fille a été prise dans une fusillade. » Je dis « Une fusillade, elle a été blessée ou... Et puis elle me dit « Mais non, elle est tuée. Et son mari aussi et son filleul. »
Sonia, la sœur aînée de Carole, se souvient aussi d'avoir traversé les heures qui ont suivi l'annonce du meurtre, comme si elle nageait en plein cauchemar.
On se dit, c'est pas possible. Dans les films, oui, mais en réalité, tirer comme ça, oui, c'est vraiment... oui, tout s'écroule, oui. On se demande ce qui se passe.
Pourquoi est-ce qu'on lui en voudrait pour la battre comme ça donc,
Pour comprendre ce qu'il s'est passé ce soir-là à Visé, les enquêteurs vont recueillir un témoignage capital. Celui d'une femme. Elle déclare avoir aperçu de sa fenêtre un individu suspect sur la scène de crime.
Les policiers trouvent rapidement une voisine qui, alertée par les coups de feu, a vu une silhouette dans le noir.
Qu'elle va décrire d'un point de vue vestimentaire habillée en sombre.
De petite taille, une silhouette de petite taille, prendre la fuite, traverser la rue.
Les policiers semblent avoir tapé à la bonne porte, car un autre témoin providentiel a également une information de taille à livrer.
Et le mari de cette voisine, lui, dit qu'il a vu dans la foulée une voiture démarrer tout feu éteint. Il s'agissait d'une berline sombre.
Malgré tout, la description du tireur et de sa voiture n'est pas assez précise. Alors pour remonter jusqu'à lui, les enquêteurs vont bénéficier d'un coup de pouce. En effet, dans ce quartier résidentiel où les habitants sont très préoccupés par leur sécurité, des caméras ont filmé une partie de la scène.
Et les caméras de surveillance ont effectivement pu saisir des images des véhicules qui arrivent vers les lieux dans l'heure qui précède les faits.
Il y a une voiture qui est arrivée peu de temps auparavant, qui s'est installée en face de la maison, et cette voiture-là, visiblement, attend.
Nous avons reconstitué les images découvertes par les policiers. À 21h48, une berline sombre arrive sur les lieux du drame. 30 minutes plus tard, à 22h18, c'est au tour de la voiture de Benoît Philippins de ralentir à proximité de son domicile. Moins de 2 minutes plus tard, la berline sombre repart tout feu éteint. Entre-temps, Le conducteur aurait donc abattu Carole, Benoît et Esteban. Malheureusement, le triple meurtre s'est déroulé en dehors du champ des caméras. Et sur les vidéos, impossible d'identifier formellement la voiture.
L'image de ce véhicule suspect ne permet pas de distinguer ni l'immatriculation et encore moins le conducteur.
Mais l'analyse de ces images va tout de même révéler un élément précieux. Le modèle de la fameuse berline sombre.
On sait maintenant qu'il circule à bord d'une BMW série 5.
Et ce n'est pas tout. L'autopsie des 3 victimes permet d'en savoir plus sur les circonstances du triple meurtre. Ce qui ne laisse aucun doute sur les intentions du tireur.
Benoît Philippens a reçu 3 balles. Carole Head a elle aussi reçu 3 balles. Et Esteban, lui, a eu une balle dans la tête.
Donc cette munition, toutes ont touché au but.
Quand on tire au 9 mm sur une personne à faible distance, au niveau supérieur du corps, c'est fait pour tuer.
Ça nous fait quand même penser à une exécution.
Dès les premières heures de cette affaire, tout porte donc à croire qu'une vengeance serait à l'origine du drame. Seulement Benoît Philippens et Carole Head étaient-ils vraiment la cible de cette exécution? Pour les proches, il s'agit forcément d'une terrible erreur. Car à les écouter, rien dans la vie du couple ne laissait présager une mort si violente. Carole et Benoît se rencontrent en 2009. Tous les deux travaillent dans la même banque. Carole, qui sort d'un divorce difficile, ne s'attend plus au coup de foudre. Pourtant, elle tombe instantanément sous le charme de Benoît, son patron.
Ils avaient été mariés tous les deux déjà avant et ils s'étaient relancés dans un second mariage. Donc je me dis, oui, c'est vraiment... c'est le bon, voilà, elle l'a fait parce qu'elle est sûre.
Le mariage est assez vite, c'est un mariage bien réussi. Au mariage, on voit bien qu'ils étaient fort amoureux.
Ça, elle avait l'air très très heureuse avec lui, donc oui, amoureuse, ça c'est certain.
Carole et Benoît forment un couple uni, très attaché aux valeurs de la famille.
C'était un couple très gai, très souriant, toujours ouvert aux autres, toujours pour faire la fête, pour rassembler la famille.
D'ailleurs, tous les dimanches soirs, donc on se retrouvait ici, donc toute la famille soupait toujours ici.
Mais alors que le couple rêve de fonder sa propre famille, tout ne se passe pas exactement comme prévu.
Pour moi, il désirait vraiment un enfant. Je pense que le projet bébé était vraiment dans leur ligne de mire.
Elle devait se faire opérer au mois de juin pour pouvoir, si elle avait des problèmes, pour pouvoir concrétiser le bébé, je vais dire.
En attendant de devenir maman, Carole reporte son amour sur son filleul Esteban, 9 ans, le fils d'une de ses amies. Elle entretient avec lui une vraie complicité.
C'est un petit garçon très précieux, tout doux, tout calme.
Voilà, un petit garçon très souriant, très poli, vraiment un enfant agréable.
Carole était une très bonne marraine. Elle n'oubliait jamais les anniversaires de son filleul.
Seulement les policiers vont découvrir que derrière cette image du couple amoureux fou se cache une toute autre réalité. En fait, Benoît Philippens était loin d'être le mari parfait. En fouillant dans la vie du directeur de banque, les enquêteurs mettent à jour une facette de sa personnalité à 1000 lieues du portrait brossé par ses proches.
Et là, les enquêteurs découvrent que Benoît n'est pas si lisse que ça.
Alors qu'il est marié à Carole Head, depuis 2 ans, Benoît Philippins serait un époux volage. La police interroge des collègues de travail et des clientes du banquier. Et beaucoup rapportent des comportements déplacés.
Benoît est un grand séducteur, il ne peut pas s'empêcher de séduire. Sur son lieu de travail, plusieurs personnes ont révélé qu'elles avaient déjà reçu des propositions de Benoît, mais que voilà, il était parfois un peu assistant sur ce côté-là.
En 2013, Sandra Chandel s'est retrouvée face à Benoît Philippins et elle se souvient d'avoir été très mal à l'aise. Ce jour-là, cette mère de famille a rendez-vous avec le directeur de l'agence. Elle vient de perdre son compagnon et elle doit régler la succession.
Je trouve que c'est un homme très avenant, très élégant, poli, vraiment très bien d'un premier abord. Donc il m'emmène avec lui dans son bureau privé.
Et très vite, l'entretien prend une tournure pour le moins gênante pour Sandra.
Il me regarde, des pieds à la tête, pendant toute la durée de l'entretien, mais de manière très soutenue. Constamment sur le décolleté. Alors parfois, il baisse la tête pour regarder en dessous de la table, les jambes, et puis il revient sur le décolleté. Je vous dis, il ne vous regardait jamais dans les yeux. Jamais, jamais, jamais. Il avait envie de nous manger. Voilà, c'était ça qu'on ressentait. On était la proie et il était le chasseur.
Si Sandra n'a pas cédé aux avances de Benoît, en revanche, d'autres femmes ont été plus sensibles à son charme.
On a pu mettre à jour, et par la simple recherche informatique et analyse des messages envoyés avec son téléphone ou son ordinateur, des mails, etc., qu'il avait eu une multitude de liaisons extra-conjugales, enfin en tout cas des liaisons avec notamment des collègues de travail.
Pour les proches du couple, déjà très affectés, la découverte de ces multiples aventures est un nouveau coup de massue.
On est tombé des nues, je veux dire, tout le monde, on s'est dit, c'est pas le Benoît qu'on connaît. Parce que ce n'était pas qu'une aventure, c'était beaucoup d'aventures. Et même encore à l'heure actuelle, c'est difficile de croire que Benoît ait pu faire ça.
Alors, les policiers se demandent si un mari jaloux n'aurait pas décidé de supprimer ce banquier trop entreprenant. Pendant des semaines, les suspects vont défiler dans le bureau des enquêteurs.
Ils ont entendu des anciennes compagnes de Benoît Philippins. Ils ont entendu même parfois les conjoints de ces compagnes, parce que le mobile, évidemment, de la vengeance pouvait jouer.
Et tous vont présenter un alibi qui sera vérifié et qui collera. Donc, en fait, ce n'est pas un mari jaloux qui a tué ce couple et cet enfant.
Pas un mari jaloux donc, mais peut-être un collègue. Car au sein de son agence bancaire, le jeune directeur de 36 ans s'était mis à dos beaucoup de monde.
Il paraît qu'il était assez sévère dans son domaine à la banque.
Quand on parle affaires, il sait ce qu'il doit faire. Donc lorsqu'on lui donne une ligne de conduite, il n'est pas là pour jouer aux billes.
Il mettait des fois un peu la pression, je sais bien, pour arriver au résultat qu'il fallait.
Si vous êtes gérant, vous avez aussi la discipline, vous vous engagez et vous licenciez. Donc on a cherché s'il n'avait pas pu, au sein du personnel de la banque, se faire des ennemis.
Ses collaborateurs vont être longuement auditionnés, leurs alibis passés au crible, là encore sans résultat. Mais ces investigations au sein de la banque vont tout de même finir par payer.
En fouillant dans les dossiers, ils vont découvrir un couple qui avait sollicité un crédit et les choses s'étaient extrêmement mal passées.
Les enquêteurs tiennent peut-être la clé de l'énigme, car vous allez voir qu'en refusant un prêt à 2 de leurs clients, Benoît et son épouse Carole ont en fait brisé les rêves d'une famille. Voici Anna Maria Troiano. Lorsque la jeune femme, d'origine sicilienne, rencontre Amedeo sur les bancs de l'école, elle n'imagine pas qu'il va devenir l'homme de sa vie.
On est tombés amoureux et puis on s'est mariés sur la suite à nos 18 ans. Je suis tombée enceinte de ma grande et donc on a un petit peu accéléré les choses, mais ça faisait longtemps qu'on se connaissait aussi, donc on savait vers quoi on voulait aller ensemble.
Au fil du temps, la famille s'agrandit. Pendant des années, le bonheur du couple est total, jusqu'en 2002. Pour Amedeo, c'est une année noire. Le père de famille, manutentionnaire dans une usine de métallurgie, enchaîne les coups durs.
Son usine est délocalisée, ce qui fait qu'il perd également son emploi.
Donc il a arrêté de travailler et il a perdu aussi, après peu de temps, son grand-père et tout, qui était fort attaché. Et avec tout ça, moralement, il n'a pas été bien.
C'est alors que dans le couple, les rôles s'inversent. Anna Maria renonce à être une mère au foyer et pour subvenir aux besoins de sa famille, elle ouvre son salon de coiffure. Amedeo, de son côté, s'occupe des enfants.
C'est un papa poule. Déjà, quand le petit il était né, c'était lui beaucoup qui se préoccupait. Elle lui donnait à manger, il prenait son bain, elle allait chercher les filles à l'école. Le matin, c'était lui qui faisait tout.
Les Troiano sont une famille assez unie, assez solide et où voilà, le cocon familial représente beaucoup pour eux.
Anna Maria et Amedeo remontent la pente, mais tout vole en éclats lorsqu'ils vont croiser la route de Carole et Benoît Philippins. Comme le salon de coiffure marche très bien, le couple voit les choses en grand. Pour concrétiser leurs rêves, ils frappent à la porte de l'agence BNP de Visé, où travaillent Benoît Philippins et sa femme Carole.
On voulait ouvrir un deuxième salon, mais pas simplement un salon, on voulait un centre de bien-être avec solarium et esthétique compris.
Reçus par Carole, les Troiano sollicitent un prêt de 175 000 €. De quoi signer le bail de leur nouveau local, lancer les travaux et couvrir l'achat onéreux de cabines à UV. Le projet est ambitieux, mais cela ne semble pas poser de soucis.
Ils ont obtenu assez rapidement un accord de principe verbal sur l'accord d'après pour financer leur projet.
C'est vrai que c'était un accord verbal. Et sur la suite, comme c'était les congés, ils nous ont dit qu'on pouvait déjà commencer le projet et que le reste allait arriver.
Sauf que la banque, à un moment donné, fait marche arrière.
Carole, qui s'était engagée oralement auprès du couple Troiano, se retrouve dans une position délicate. Elle se tourne donc vers Benoît, son mari, et le directeur de l'agence prend la main sur ce dossier épineux.
Monsieur Benoît Philippins est son supérieur. Donc forcément, à un moment donné, il essaye de faire en sorte que le contrat puisse se passer.
Mais la hiérarchie considère que le couple Anna Maria et Amedeo n'ont pas les reins suffisamment solides pour emprunter une telle somme d'argent et donc vont refuser de leur accorder leur crédit.
On est mal parce qu'on se dit qu'on est lancé dans un projet, que tout a démarré et qu'on est perdu. On dit qu'est-ce qu'on va faire, quoi.
Les Troiano ont déjà investi près de 50 000 € dans ce deuxième salon de coiffure. Alors, pour eux, ce refus, c'est le début de la descente aux enfers.
Ils se sont engagés financièrement sur la deuxième affaire, mais ça va leur coûter la première affaire. C'est-à-dire que, faute de financement de la banque, ils ne peuvent même plus payer leurs charges et leur loyer du premier salon de coiffure qui marchait très bien.
Pour éponger les dettes, Le couple Troiano est même contraint de vendre leur maison et de déménager.
Ils habitent chez les parents de M. Troiano avec leurs propres enfants. Donc tout le monde vit dans la même maison pour limiter justement les dépenses. C'est bien la preuve que la situation est délicate.
Totalement sur la paille, Anna Maria et Amedeo assignent la banque en justice. Pendant de longs mois, ils vont se battre pour obtenir gain de cause. Et en juin 2013, le coup près tombe.
Finalement, le couple sera débouté. Ils n'avaient pas d'accord écrit, c'était juste un accord verbal qui ne vaut rien. Ils ont été juste trop vite dans leurs investissements.
Les policiers voient en eux des suspects magnifiques. Ils ont un vrai mobile.
Anna Maria et Amedeo Troiano auraient-ils exécuté froidement leurs banquiers, Carole et Benoît Philippins, pour se venger de ne pas avoir eu leur prêt? Esteban, 9 ans, est-il une victime collatérale? L'hypothèse est séduisante. L'enquête se concentre sur Amedeo Troiano. Car en plus de ses déboires judiciaires avec la banque, les policiers vont découvrir que l'homme n'est pas un enfant de cœur.
Il a déjà été condamné pour des faits de violence, des violences graves. On parle de faits de banditisme, on parle d'un carjacking, donc de braquage d'un automobiliste. Et donc il sait probablement manier une arme.
Et ce n'est pas le seul élément accablant pour le père de famille.
Les policiers vont s'intéresser au véhicule d'Amedeo Troiano. On se souvient que le soir des faits, par la vidéo, on avait vu une BMW.
Il y a une corrélation entre cette voiture-là et la voiture utilisée par Troiano, qui est une BMW 5, ancien modèle.
Tout aussi compromettant, il y a ce SMS retrouvé dans le téléphone portable de Carole Head, la banquière. Un message de menace envoyé par Amedeo Troiano qui laisse penser qu'il souhaitait se venger suite au refus du prêt. Ce texto, le voici.
Madame Head, juste une simple question. Pourquoi je suis dans cette situation? Dites-le moi, car il y va de la santé de tout le monde. Je pense que vous avez très bien compris.
C'est une menace à peine voilée. Hein. C'est en gros, démerde-toi pour avoir mon crédit, sinon ça va mal se finir.
Oui, les éléments s'accumulent contre Troiano. Il conduit une BMW série 5 sombre. Il y a le SMS de menace. Il a un mobile, le crédit refusé.
Donc tout ça ne joue pas en sa faveur.
Le 13 mai 2011, soit 3 semaines après la tuerie survenue à Visé, les policiers se présentent au domicile des parents d'Amedeo Troiano. Cette visite au petit matin, Anna Maria s'en souvient comme si c'était hier.
Ils ont toqué à la porte et ils sont rentrés peut-être une dizaine dans la maison, on n'avait pas bougé.
Moi, j'étais encore à mon lit et les enfants ils étaient levés le matin pour aller à l'école.
Franchement, vous demandez qu'est-ce qui vous arrive parce que on est une famille ordinaire.
Sous les yeux de la famille Troiano, la maison est fouillée de fond en comble. L'ordinateur d'Amedeo est saisi. À l'intérieur, les enquêteurs découvrent une recherche sur Internet qui va conforter leurs soupçons.
Ils vont découvrir que Troiano a, au mois de mars, donc avant les faits du 18 avril, fait une recherche autour de la banque qui est du nom de Benoît pour trouver le domicile de Benoît. Ça, c'est quand même particulièrement interpellant, puisqu'on est à peu près 5 à 6 semaines avant les faits.
C'est la preuve qu'on veut savoir où ils habitent et que, éventuellement, si on veut les retrouver pour les tuer, on connaît désormais leur adresse.
Pour les policiers, difficile de croire qu'il puisse s'agir d'une coïncidence. À présent, Amedeo Troiano va devoir s'expliquer et trouver de bons arguments pour prouver qu'il n'est pas l'assassin de Benoît, Carole et Esteban. Au commissariat de Visé, les enquêteurs sont certains de tenir le tueur qu'ils recherchent depuis près d'un mois. Seulement contre toute attente, Amedeo Troiano va démonter point par point les accusations dont il fait l'objet. À commencer par l'image de délinquant qui lui colle à la peau.
Il dit qu'il a été à l'époque condamné pour des faits en rapport avec des armes, mais qu'en tout cas depuis un certain temps il n'a plus d'armes et qu'il n'en a pas à son domicile, et d'ailleurs on n'en a pas trouvé lorsqu'on est allé en perquisition chez lui.
Il a été condamné une fois quand il était jeune, et il a fait 6 mois. Il a compris ses erreurs aussi et le mal que ça avait pu faire.
Là on est quand même, je crois, 13 ou 14 ans plus tard. L'homme incontestablement n'est plus le même. Bien entendu, son casier est interpellant, mais on n'est pas du tout dans le même cas de figure. On parle d'un assassinat.
Pour la famille d'Amedeo Troiano, l'homme qu'ils connaissent n'aurait jamais pu assassiner 3 personnes, et surtout pas un enfant de 9 ans.
Je suis convaincue que mon mari n'a pas fait les actes qu'on l'accuse. On veut le faire passer pour un monstre et il ne l'est pas. Non, pas du tout. Et il est père de famille, il adore ses enfants plus que tout au monde et il ne serait jamais déjà faire du mal à un enfant.
Je suis sûre et certaine que mon fils n'a jamais fait ça. Je suis sûre.
Et l'accusation ne va pas tarder à complètement s'effondrer. Car Amedeo Troiano dispose d'un solide alibi. Le 18 avril 2014, à l'heure de la fusillade, il n'était pas en Belgique.
Donc l'après-midi du drame, les Troiano ils visitent notamment une maison qu'ils veulent louer parce qu'ils veulent déménager. Troiano propose de payer 6 mois de loyer en avance pour montrer qu'il n'a pas de problème financier, mais avec le compte de la société. S'ensuit une dispute entre Amedeo et son épouse, et le ton monte.
On se prend un peu la tête comme couple dans toute maison. Je crois que c'est normal de se prendre la tête avec son mari. Et donc, voilà, il s'en va de la maison. Pour changer les idées, il a voulu rendre visite à sa famille en Allemagne.
Et il explique qu'il est parti un peu comme ça sur un coup de tête en Allemagne. Sans prévenir quiconque.
Il dit être arrivé dans la ville de Stuttgart vers 22 h. C'est formidable, ça c'est l'alibi rêvé, puisqu'on sait que le triple meurtre a été commis entre 22h15 et 22h30. Donc s'il était à 22 h à Stuttgart, effectivement, là, ça le sort définitivement de tous les ennuis.
Et l'avocat de la défense, maître Zeven, va enfoncer le clou. Pour lui, il y a un témoin dans ce dossier qui innocenterait totalement son client. Souvenez-vous, la voisine de Benoît et Carole Philippins dit avoir aperçu le tireur de ses fenêtres le soir du drame.
Il y a un élément qui est embêtant, c'est cette voisine qui décrit le tueur, qui dit que c'est un petit bonhomme. Or, Amedeo mesure 1,92 m pour 130 kg.
Donc c'est pas une petite personne. C'est pas quelqu'un qu'on oublie, c'est quelqu'un de costaud.
Avec sa carrure de rugbyman, Amedeo ne passe pas inaperçu. Alors comment expliquer le témoignage de la voisine? Et encore plus étrange, comment expliquer les derniers mots de Carole avant de mourir?
Au moment où le policier va recueillir les derniers mots de Carole, elle dit qu'elle ne connaît pas le tueur.
La phrase est importante. Ça sous-entend, semble-t-il en tout cas, qu'elle a effectivement vu la personne, mais qu'elle ne le connaît pas, donc elle n'a pas pu l'identifier.
Or, s'il s'agit d'Amedeo, elle le connaît forcément parce qu'elle a été en contact professionnel avec lui.
Je trouve que c'est une preuve en plus qu'elle ne l'a pas reconnu. C'est encore un élément du dossier qui reste une preuve que mon mari n'a pas fait ça.
Un physique qui ne correspond pas au témoignage. Une image de bon père de famille. Un alibi le soir du meurtre. Amedeo Troiano est loin du suspect idéal. Il est donc remis en liberté à la suite de son audition. Alors les enquêteurs font-ils fausse route? Ou sont-ils face à un grand manipulateur? Persuadés qu'Amedeo Troiano ne dit pas toute la vérité, les policiers décident de se rendre à Stuttgart en Allemagne, sur commission rogatoire pour vérifier son alibi. Ils interrogent Mario Troiano, le cousin d'Amedeo. L'homme est restaurateur et il va, sans le savoir, faire basculer l'enquête.
On va découvrir qu'il n'est pas du tout arrivé le vendredi vers 22h30, mais qu'il est plutôt arrivé le samedi vers 11h30 ou midi.
En effet, Mario Troiano, le cousin, se souvient avec précision de l'heure d'arrivée d'Amedeo. Et pour cause, il était tellement débordé ce jour-là qu'il n'était pas ravi de le voir débarquer au beau milieu du service du déjeuner.
Monsieur Troiano arrive très gentiment, la bouche en cœur. Il arrive dans ce qui est quasiment un coup de feu au niveau du restaurant et il arrive comme quelqu'un qui n'est pas très frais puisqu'il a dû rouler une bonne partie de la nuit pour arriver là-bas.
Et là, ça change tout. Parce que là, il a eu parfaitement le temps de commettre ses crimes, puis ensuite de prendre la route. L'alibi d'Amedeo s'effondre complètement.
Amedeo Troiano est donc en fâcheuse posture. S'il ne veut pas finir derrière les barreaux, il va devoir fournir une explication plus convaincante. 5 mois après le triple meurtre, il est donc placé en garde à vue. Et sans surprise, il va faire volte-face.
Confronté à cette réalité-là, il est complètement parti sur un autre alibi.
Souvenez-vous, Amedeo avait déclaré que le jour du drame, il avait quitté le domicile conjugal suite à une dispute. Mais contrairement à sa première déposition, ce n'était pas pour aller en Allemagne.
Amedeo explique aux enquêteurs qu'en réalité, ce soir-là, après s'être disputé avec Anna Maria, il a pris la route, donc, comme il l'avait déjà dit la première fois, sauf qu'en cours de route, il s'est arrêté, il a envisagé de mettre fin à ses jours, et d'ailleurs, il a plus qu'envisagé de mettre fin à ses jours, il a absorbé un certain nombre de médicaments.
Et ça devient l'hypothèse. Je suis allé dans un chemin de campagne tout seul dans ma voiture, j'ai avalé des médicaments, j'ai essayé de me suicider, je me suis réveillé à 5h du matin.
Aussi incroyable que cela puisse paraître, le miraculé aurait finalement décidé au petit matin de rejoindre Stuttgart.
Il n'a plus envie de mourir et donc il décide de rejoindre ses cousins. Et ensuite, il arrive vers midi à Stuttgart. En réalité, dans les deux alibis, il n'est pas sur la commune de Vissé au moment du crime.
Un nouvel alibi bien pratique, mais qui laisse les policiers perplexes. Car ils ont mis la main sur un indice pour le moins compromettant. En 5 mois d'enquête, tous les objets saisis lors de la perquisition au domicile des Troiano ont été expertisés. Notamment l'ordinateur du père de famille. Et ce qu'il contient va trahir le suspect.
Il est géolocalisé en temps réel devant le domicile du couple avec son ordinateur.
Amedeo est donc venu quelques jours avant le drame, au domicile de son banquier. Et c'est avec son ordinateur via Google Maps qu'il aurait repéré le meilleur itinéraire pour fuir en Allemagne.
En face de la maison Philippines, il y a le hall omnisport. Et le hall omnisport bénéficie d'un Wi-Fi qui est libre. Et cet ordinateur-là a utilisé cette borne Wi-Fi. Et il va rechercher quoi comme itinéraire? Quel est l'endroit le plus sûr de pouvoir repartir rapidement pour rejoindre l'autoroute et partir vers l'Allemagne?
Et ça ressemble donc à tous les signes, 1 de la culpabilité et 2 de la préméditation.
Seulement, il reste à confirmer que le suspect était également sur place la nuit de la fusillade. Et pour cela, les enquêteurs organisent une reconstitution avec lui, mais aussi avec son véhicule personnel.
L'idée étant de faire à Troiano la même chose que ce que la voiture qu'on voit sur les images des caméras de surveillance a fait.
Ce qui va permettre aux policiers, aux services d'enquête spécialisés, de faire les points de comparaison entre son véhicule tel qu'il est passé le jour de la reconstitution et le véhicule qui était enregistré.
Et là, la ressemblance est saisissante. C'est les mêmes voitures. On a l'impression qu'on peut les superposer.
Tout semble indiquer qu'Amedeo Troiano est l'auteur de ce triple meurtre. D'autant que l'homme a commis une ultime erreur, une erreur qui va l'envoyer tout droit devant les assises. En effet, les vêtements qu'il a remis à la police lors de la perquisition à son domicile, quelques mois plus tôt, présentent des résidus de poudre.
On va retrouver des traces de poudre à la fois sur la veste et également sur le béret que portait Amedeo ce soir-là.
Ces traces de poudre montrent que la personne qui portait ces vêtements, donc la veste et le béret, a utilisé une arme à feu. Donc ça, c'est une évidence.
Le 10 septembre 2014, Amedeo Troiano est mis en examen pour triple homicide avec préméditation. En apprenant la nouvelle, les proches de Carole, Benoît et Esteban sont abasourdis.
On ne pense pas à ça qu'un père de famille pourrait aller tuer comme ça pour moi, pour des broutilles, voilà.
Faut être fou pour faire quelque chose comme ça. Enfin, le plus dur, c'est qu'il nie, malgré tout ce qu'il y a contre lui.
C'est bizarre, il y a trop de mensonges dans son témoignage, donc s'il ment comme ça, c'est qu'il a quelque chose à cacher.
Tout l'accable. Pour moi, vraiment.
Alors, coupable ou innocent? Le 6 février 2017, le procès d'Amedeo Troiano s'ouvre devant les assises de Liège. Pour l'assassinat de Benoît, Carole et Esteban, il risque la réclusion criminelle à perpétuité. Discrets depuis le début de l'affaire, les parents du petit Esteban sont cette fois au premier rang. Avec les familles de Carole et de Benoît, ils ont décidé d'affronter cette épreuve, main dans la main.
On était tous là pour montrer qu'on était là et face à lui et qu'on allait gagner tous ensemble, quoi, contre lui, ça c'est clair.
Et ça, c'était un poids de force énorme pour faire face à ce tueur fou qui était devant eux.
Sur ces images filmées par une équipe de télévision locale, on voit l'accusé entrer dans la salle d'audience. Son visage a été masqué à la demande du président de la Cour afin de respecter la présomption d'innocence.
Il va plaider non coupable et donc c'est un peu tout ou rien.
Soit il est acquitté, soit il est lourdement condamné, parce que n'oublions pas qu'il y a un enfant de 9 ans qui a trouvé la mort dans cette affaire.
Dès les premières heures du procès, le comportement d'Amedeo Troiano révolte les proches des victimes.
Pitoyable, comme si de rien n'était. Monsieur, je ne parle pas. Monsieur, j'ignore tout. C'est pitoyable.
C'est vraiment affreux de le voir assis sur le banc, qui n'a rien fait, et qu'on l'accuse, qu'on le montre du doigt, comme ça, qu'on le salit.
C'est quelqu'un qui a du mal à s'exprimer. Il est resté plus ou moins silencieux pendant le procès, si ce n'est pour répéter qu'il était innocent.
Et si Amedeo ne fait pas bonne figure, les avocats de la défense vont tout de même parvenir à instiller le doute dans la tête des jurés. L'accusé a un physique qui ne correspond pas au témoignage. C'est un bon père de famille, et surtout Carole Head, la victime, ne l'a pas reconnu.
Si c'était lui, je pense qu'elle l'aurait reconnu, tout simplement. Donc je reste encore aujourd'hui persuadé que ce n'est pas lui l'auteur des tirs. Et par certaines questions que les jurés posaient à certains moments du procès, on a pu comprendre que ceux-ci doutaient aussi.
Mais cela ne va pas durer.
Il y a un moment pendant ce procès où les choses vont basculer et pas à son avantage.
Au 6e jour du procès, la salle découvre avec stupéfaction la botte secrète de la partie civile. Une vidéo découverte dans le portable d'Amedeo et qui prouve que l'accusé ment depuis le début.
A priori, d'ailleurs, cette vidéo s'est déclenchée involontairement. On a l'impression que Amedeo a voulu allumer la lampe torche de son téléphone.
Il s'est filmé à son insu et on le voit glisser une arme sous son oreiller.
Alors, Troiano a toujours dit « j'ai jamais eu d'arme, j'ai jamais tiré, j'ai jamais eu de munitions ».
Incroyable. Sur ces images tournées 1 an avant le triple meurtre, on voit clairement que le père de famille possédait bien une arme à feu. Mêlé à des affaires de banditisme dans sa jeunesse, il semble qu'il avait gardé la vieille habitude d'avoir toujours à portée de main un pistolet, et pas n'importe lequel.
Il s'agit d'un pistolet automatique 9 mm.
Cette arme qu'on voit sur l'image est de même marque et de même modèle que celle qui a servi à tuer les victimes.
Et là, tout le monde se dit, tu dis que tu n'as pas d'arme, mais là, on voit clairement que c'est toi et que tu la glisses sous ton oreiller. Donc les gens se rendent vraiment compte qu'il est vraiment tout à fait dans le mensonge et que ça confirme vraiment ce que tout le monde pensait à ce moment-là.
De le voir là dire qu'il est innocent, alors malgré toutes les preuves qu'on a contre lui, je me dis c'est pas possible, à un moment donné, il va craquer.
Et justement, au 8e jour du procès, l'accusé rompt enfin le silence devant une assemblée médusée. Toute la salle est suspendue à ce que le tueur présumé va dire. Va-t-il reconnaître les faits? Pour les parents du petit Esteban, c'est maintenant leur dernier espoir de connaître la vérité.
J'ai moi-même des enfants, et je comprends tout à fait votre deuil. Jamais je n'aurais touché un cheveu de votre enfant.
Pourquoi ne parlez-vous pas alors?
J'ai du mal à parler. J'ai 3 enfants, jamais de la vie je ne ferai du mal à un enfant. Je suis innocent. On partage les mêmes problèmes, notre souffrance est la même.
Non, vos enfants sont encore en vie.
Pour les proches des victimes, les mots d'Amedeo Troiano ont un goût amer. Après 14 jours de procès, les jurés sont finalement convaincus de sa culpabilité. Amedeo Troiano est condamné à la perpétuité pour l'assassinat de Benoît et pour les meurtres de Carole et Esteban. La préméditation n'ayant pas été retenue pour ces 2 dernières victimes.
On est soulagés qu'enfin il y ait une justice pour notre petit garçon. On va pouvoir au moins continuer notre deuil, je veux dire. Voilà, oui. Parce que nous, on est punis à perpète, là, de toute façon. Jamais ils ne reviendront, de toute manière.
En Belgique, il n'est pas possible de faire appel. Amedeo Troiano a déposé un recours auprès de la Cour de cassation et de la Cour européenne des droits de l'homme, mais ces demandes ont été rejetées.
C'est une erreur judiciaire. Je ne vais pas en rester là, je vais essayer de me battre pour mes enfants et mon mari.
À Visé et dans toute la Belgique, personne n'a oublié le drame qui a fait voler en éclats la vie de 3 innocents. Malgré le temps qui passe, le sentiment d'incompréhension et d'injustice continue de hanter leurs proches.
Ils avaient toute la vie devant eux, ils avaient tout pour être heureux et que c'est un drame que je souhaite à personne et elle me manquera toujours vraiment.
C'était Enquêtes criminelles. Merci à tous de nous avoir suivis. Je vous rappelle que vous pouvez retrouver notre émission en podcast sur rtl.fr, sur l'application RTL et sur toutes les plateformes partenaires. Très bonne fin de soirée sur W9.
It begins with a silence that shouldn't exist. California, late summer, 2003. The air is heavy, unmoving, thick with heat that clings to skin and settles into walls. Midnight passes quietly, the kind of quiet that feels ordinary, forgettable, harmless. A woman steps inside her apartment, closes the door behind her, and becomes part of that silence. Hours later, she is gone. No sound, no straggle, no trace of panic left behind. Just absence, clean, precise, unnatural. By dawn, nothing makes sense. Her car is still there, parked in its usual spot, angled slightly toward the curb like it always was. The passenger seat holds her purse, neatly placed, untouched. The dashboard clock blinks faintly. The engine is cold. Too cold for someone who planned to leave again. Inside the apartment, the air feels wrong. Not disturbed. Not violent. Just interrupted. A glass of water sits on the kitchen counter, half full. A chair pulled slightly away from the table, as if someone stood up too quickly. A hallway light still burning, casting a weak glow that stretches into the living room. There is no forced entry. No broken locks. No shattered windows. No sign that anyone was ever there except her. And yet she is gone. Police arrive within minutes of the call. They move carefully, quietly, as if the apartment itself might reveal something if they don't disturb it too much. Gloves snap into place. Cameras flash. Every surface is examined, every angle considered. But the scene offers nothing. No fingerprints beyond the expected. No DNA out of place. No evidence of violence. Only questions. Neighbors gather outside, whispering. Some claim they heard something during the night. A door closing. Footsteps in the hallway. Maybe a car engine idling too long. Or maybe nothing at all. Because memory begins to shift the moment fear takes hold. Detectives canvass the building. Knock on doors. Ask the same questions again and again. Did you see anything? Did you hear anything? Did anyone seem out of place? Answers blur together. Maybe. I'm not sure. I think. Nothing solid. Nothing that holds. And then, quietly, almost reluctantly, a phrase begins to circulate between officers. Cold case. Not official. Not yet. But the shape of it is already forming. A disappearance too clean, too controlled. The kind that doesn't unravel easily. The woman's life becomes the center of everything. Friends describe her as routine-driven, predictable, careful. She didn't take risks. Didn't disappear without telling someone. Didn't leave doors unlocked or invite strangers inside. There are no obvious enemies. No recent arguments. No threats. No reason. Her last known movements are reconstructed with precision. Grocery store at 7:12 p.m. Receipt confirmed. A short phone call at 8:03 p.m. Casual. Normal. Nothing unusual in her tone. No hint of fear. She returns home shortly after. That is the last confirmed moment she exists in the world. After that, nothing. Days stretch into weeks. Flyers appear across the neighborhood. Her face printed in stark black and white. Missing. Please help. Phone numbers at the bottom that ring endlessly, carrying hope that slowly begins to thin. The community shifts. Doors lock earlier. Windows close tighter. Strangers are watched longer than necessary. Conversations lower when unfamiliar footsteps pass by. Because something happened here. Something precise. Something practiced. And whoever did it left no trace. Detectives revisit the apartment over and over, hoping something was missed. A fiber. A print. A sign of entry hidden in plain sight. But every time the same result. Nothing. Until a detail surfaces. Small. Fragile. Easy to dismiss. A man. Not clearly seen. Not identified. Just remembered. A figure standing near the building on multiple occasions. Watching. Waiting. Lingering longer than anyone else. Descriptions vary. Tall. Maybe. Dark hair. Possibly. Average build. Unremarkable. The kind of face that disappears in a crowd. The kind you forget seconds after looking away. A sketch is created anyway. Lines drawn from uncertain memory. A face that looks almost real, almost specific, but not quite enough. It's released to the public. No calls come in. No one recognizes him. Or no one admits to. The investigation slows. Leads dry up. Interviews repeat. Detectives begin to circle the same ground, asking the same questions, receiving the same empty answers. Time becomes the enemy. Weeks turn into months. Months into years. The file grows thicker, heavier, filled with reports, transcripts, photographs that never change. And eventually, the word becomes official. Cold case. The moment when movement stops. But the weight doesn't. The file is boxed, stored, not forgotten, but set aside, waiting for something new, something different, something that might never come. Life continues around it. The apartment is cleaned, reoccupied. The neighborhood adjusts, then adapts, then slowly returns to something resembling normal. But the absence remains. A gap that never fully closes. Detectives move on to other cases. New faces replace old ones. Fresh eyes scan aging reports, searching for something that was missed. Nothing emerges. Years pass quietly. Until technology changes everything. 2019. A piece of evidence, collected long ago, nearly insignificant at the time, is re-examined. Advances in forensic science allow for deeper analysis, sharper results, connections that once seemed impossible. DNA is extracted. Run through databases that didn't exist in 2003. And suddenly a response. Not a direct match. But close enough. A relative. A thread. Investigators lean forward. The case file is reopened. Dust disturbed. Pages turned once more. A family tree begins to take shape. Names branching outward. Generations mapped carefully, methodically. Patterns emerge. And within those patterns, one name stands out. A man. Living quietly. No violent history. No major arrests. No reason to draw attention. Which makes him dangerous. Because the most invisible people are often the hardest to find. Surveillance begins. Unnoticed. Unhurried. Controlled. They watch him move through daily life. Work. Home. Routine. Predictable patterns that reveal nothing and everything at once. He keeps to himself. Minimal interaction. Controlled behavior. No outbursts. No obvious signs of instability. But something feels wrong. Too calm. Too contained. As if every movement is measured. As if every moment is rehearsed. Investigators wait. Because patience is everything now. And then comes the opportunity. A discarded object. Something he touched. Something he left behind without thinking. Collected quietly. Sent to the lab. The wait is short. The result is not. Match. Exact. 16 years collapse into a single confirmation. He is no longer a possibility. He is the answer. But the shock doesn't end there. Because when investigators dig into old records, they find him again. 2003. His name in the file. Interviewed. Briefly, casually, one of many. He had stood in front of them. Spoken. Answered questions. And walked away. No suspicion strong enough to hold him. No evidence to stop him. No instinct that screamed loud enough. He slipped through. And stayed free for 16 years. The realization is devastating. Old transcripts are pulled. Audio reviewed. Every word analyzed again, now with new weight, new meaning. His voice sounds different. Calmer. Colder. Was he nervous? Was he confident? Did he believe, even then, that he had already won? The arrest is quiet. No silence. No spectacle. Just a knock. A door opens. His name is spoken. And he doesn't run. Doesn't resist. Doesn't panic. He simply watches. That detail lingers. Because innocence reacts. It denies. It fights. It breaks under pressure. But he remains still. As if he knew this moment would come. As if the years in between were borrowed. The news spreads fast. Headlines erupt. California, 2003 cold case cracked. Suspect identified. Arrest shocks investigators. The community responds with a mix of relief and disbelief. A face long gone returns to the present. A story buried in memory resurfaces with force. But closure feels incomplete. Because questions remain. Why her? Why that night? Why no trace? Interrogations begin. Long, methodical, relentless. He speaks but carefully. Fragments, half-answers, deflections wrapped in calm delivery. Enough to acknowledge. Never enough to explain. Investigators push harder. But the truth stays just out of reach. And even as the case moves forward, even as the world begins to label it solved, something remains unresolved. Because knowing who is only part of the story. And without the why, the silence never truly ends. It only changes shape. And somewhere, beneath layers of time and memory, that night in 2003 still exists exactly as it happened. Quiet. Ordinary. Until it wasn't. Until a door closed. And never opened again. The room feels smaller once his name is spoken out loud. Fluorescent lights hum above. A recorder clicks on. Time compresses into seconds that stretch too long. Across the table, he sits still, hands folded, posture controlled, eyes steady but unreadable. 16 years of silence now contained in a single body. Detectives begin carefully. Routine questions. Identity. Background. Work history. The rhythm is deliberate, almost slow, designed to pull him into comfort, to let him believe this is just another conversation. But nothing about this is routine. Because every word he speaks is now measured against the weight of what they know. He answers calmly. No hesitation. No visible fear. His voice is even, almost detached, as if he's discussing someone else's life. That's what unsettles them first. Not anger. Not denial. Control. They shift the conversation. 2003. The year lands heavily between them. He nods, acknowledges it, but his expression doesn't change. He remembers the neighborhood. Remembers being there. Remembers speaking to officers when they canvassed the area. Of course he does. Because he was there. The detectives let the silence stretch. Let the memory settle. Let him sit in it. Then they place the evidence on the table. DNA. A single word that changes everything. For the first time, something flickers. Not panic. Not shock. Recognition. A pause, barely noticeable, but enough. He leans back slightly, exhales through his nose, eyes lowering for just a moment before returning to the same controlled stare. And then he speaks. Carefully. Too carefully. He doesn't deny immediately, doesn't react the way innocent people do. Instead, he asks questions. How was it collected? Where was it found? How certain is the match? Buying time. Building space. The detectives press forward. Exact match. No ambiguity. No room for interpretation. His silence returns. But now it feels different. He's not calm anymore. He's calculating. Because the truth is closed in, and he knows it. Outside the interrogation room, investigators move fast. Teams reopen every file connected to the case. Evidence boxes are unpacked, photographs laid out, timelines reconstructed with new urgency. Every detail is re-examined, now anchored to a suspect who had hidden in plain sight. They trace his movements back to 2003. Work records, phone logs, financial activity. Patterns begin to form. He lived close, too close, within walking distance of the apartment, close enough to observe routines, close enough to wait without being noticed. Neighbors from years ago are contacted again. Memories are fragile, faded, but some details return under pressure. Yes, someone used to linger. Yes, there was a man who didn't seem to belong. Yes, maybe it was him. But maybe isn't enough. Inside the room, the questioning sharpens. They shift tone, less conversational, more direct. Why was your DNA there? The question lands hard. He doesn't answer immediately. His fingers tighten slightly, the first physical crack, small but real. Then he offers an explanation. Vague, incomplete, a coincidence, a possibility, something that sounds plausible on the surface, but collapses under scrutiny. The detectives know it. And he knows they know it. The tension rises. They begin to introduce details only the perpetrator would understand. The positioning of objects, the timing, the absence of forced entry. Each piece narrows the space around him. Each detail removes another escape. His response is slow. Less confident now, more fragmented. But still no confession. Not fully. He skirts the edges, admits proximity, admits being near, admits seeing her before. But stops short of crossing the line. Because once he crosses it, there's no coming back. Hours pass. The room grows heavier, air thicker, silence louder. He asks for water. A simple request, but it breaks the rhythm. When the cup is placed in front of him, his hand lingers on it a second too long. A subtle tremor, the control slipping, just enough to notice. Detectives lean in again. They revisit the night. Step by step. They reconstruct it in front of him. Every movement, every minute, filling in gaps with evidence, with logic, with pressure. You were there. You watched. You waited. No answer. You knew she was alone. His jaw tightens. You approached. His eyes shift slightly, just for a moment. You got inside. Silence. And then something changes. His breathing deepens. Not faster, just heavier. The weight of the narrative pressing down. He speaks again. Quietly. Different tone now. He doesn't confess. But he doesn't deny. Instead, he corrects. A small detail, a minor point in the timeline. But it's enough. Because corrections don't come from innocence. They come from knowledge. The room freezes. Detectives exchange glances, subtle but charged. They have him closer than ever. Outside, the case is already exploding across media. Headlines dominate. News vans line the streets that once forgot the story. Microphones thrust toward anyone willing to speak. Cold case solved. Arrest after 16 years. But inside this room nothing feels solved. Because the truth is still incomplete. They push again. Harder now. What happened that night? The question hangs. He closes his eyes briefly, the longest pause yet. When he opens them, something has shifted. Not remorse. Not regret. Acceptance. But only partially. He begins to speak. Fragments. Disconnected pieces. He talks about seeing her before, watching routines, noticing patterns, small observations that grew into something darker. He describes the building, the layout, the timing. His voice remains steady. Too steady. As if recounting a memory that has been rehearsed over and over again in his mind. But when it comes to the moment, the exact moment, everything changed. He stops. Silence again. Refusal. The detectives press. Did you take her? No answer. Did you hurt her? Nothing. Where is she? His gaze drops. And for the first time there's something close to emotion. Not grief. Not guilt. Something colder. Something final. He leans back again. Shakes his head slightly. And says nothing. The interrogation stalls. Hours of progress halted at the edge of truth. Because he won't go further. Won't give them what they need most. The location. The answer. The end. Outside, investigators widen the search. Old areas are revisited. Remote locations examined. Places connected to his past, his movements, his routines. Ground that has been untouched for years is suddenly alive with activity again. But time has erased too much. Evidence fades. Land changes. Memories distort. And the silence remains. Back in the room, the weight settles in. They have the man. They have the evidence. But they don't have the story. Not completely. And without it, the case still breathes in fragments. He is charged. Formally, publicly. The system moves forward. Court dates, legal proceedings, structured steps toward accountability. But for those who lived through the disappearance, for those who waited, for those who never stopped asking, something is still missing. Because justice without answers feels incomplete. The apartment still exists. Different people, different lives. But the walls remember. The hallway still holds the same dimensions, the same angles, the same quiet. And somewhere in that space, the last moment she was seen alive still echoes. Unchanged. Unresolved. As if time never fully moved on. And now, with the man finally identified, with a cold case cracked open after years of silence, the truth sits just out of reach. Close enough to feel. Far enough to never fully hold. Because some cases don't end when the suspect is found. They end when the story is told. And this story is still unfinished. The courtroom does not feel like justice at first. It feels like pressure. Heavy air, wooden benches filled with faces that have waited too long, cameras behind glass, whispered conversations cut short whenever the defendant is brought in. The man from the cold case sits in silence. Not the silence of fear. Not the silence of confusion. But the silence of someone conserving every expression, every movement, every possible signal. 16 years removed from the night everything began, he now exists in a different kind of spotlight. Not hidden anymore. Not anonymous. Every detail of him now measured, observed, analyzed. And yet he still looks unchanged. Controlled. Composed. Almost detached from the gravity of the room. The prosecutor stands. The first words are enough to change the temperature. They speak of disappearance. Of a woman who left no goodbye, no warning, no chance to be found. They speak of the apartment frozen in time, the untouched purse, the glass of water that never dried, the hallway light that never turned off. Each detail lands like a slow strike. Not emotional. Structural. Building a framework the jury cannot ignore. The defense listens carefully. They are prepared for evidence. But not for certainty. Because certainty is what the prosecution is trying to build brick by brick from fragments that have survived time itself. The DNA evidence is introduced early. No hesitation. No questioning. A direct match. The word echoes through the courtroom like a door closing. The defense objects. Procedural arguments. Chain of custody. Time gaps. Technology changes. The usual architecture of doubt. But the science does not bend easily. The jury watches the exchange with shifting expressions. Some lean forward. Some sit rigid. Some refuse to look at the defendant entirely. He remains still. Not reacting. Not acknowledging. As if the entire system is operating in a parallel reality that does not require his participation. Then the timeline is reconstructed. 2003. The last night. The prosecution walks the court through it slowly, deliberately, each moment placed into position like pieces of evidence forming a single image. Her arrival home, the final phone call, the last confirmed sighting. Then the silence. The absence. The gap that swallowed everything after. They introduce witnesses. Neighbors. People who once said, maybe, and I think, and I'm not sure. Now, years later, those fragments have sharpened. A figure seen near the building. A man lingering longer than normal. A presence that felt wrong but was never confirmed. The sketch is shown again. Faded now, but still recognizable in its ambiguity. The defendant's face is compared beside it. The resemblance is not exact. But it does not need to be. Because recognition in cases like this is not about precision. It is about memory. And memory is fragile, but persistent. The prosecution then introduces something more unsettling. Behavior. Patterns. Proximity. The man lived close to the victim. Close enough to observe routines without detection. Close enough to disappear into normality while watching something no one else noticed. The word opportunity is repeated. Not as accusation alone, but as structure. Opportunity, access, silence. The defense rises again. They challenge interpretation. They question assumptions. They emphasize lack of direct eyewitness testimony. Lack of physical violence evidence recovered from the scene. They try to rebuild distance between suspicion and certainty. But distance is no longer enough. Because the DNA evidence sits in the center of everything like a locked weight no argument can lift. The courtroom feels it. Even the air feels heavier when it is mentioned again. The defendant finally speaks during proceedings. Only briefly. Only when required. His voice is calm, but stripped of emotion. He denies responsibility in measured terms. He acknowledges presence in the area. He acknowledges past questioning. But he does not explain. He does not expand. He does not offer narrative. And that absence of narrative becomes its own kind of tension. Because the human mind expects story. Even in silence, it searches for structure. But he offers none. The prosecution responds with something different. Not emotion. Not speculation. But reconstruction. They present a minute-by-minute breakdown of what they believe occurred after she returned home. The timeline tightens. The gaps shrink. The space between facts begins to disappear. They describe entry. They describe control. They describe disappearance. The courtroom does not hear it as storytelling. It hears it as inevitability being assembled in real time. The jury watches the defendant closely during this segment. Still no reaction. Still no visible crack. But observers begin to notice something else. Stillness is not always neutrality. Sometimes it is containment. As if something inside has already been sealed off. A witness is then called who changes the atmosphere again. A forensic analyst. Calm voice. Clinical language. No emotional weight. They explain the DNA match again, but in simpler terms. Clearer. Harder to escape. The probability numbers are spoken slowly, deliberately, so each digit can settle. 1 in billions. The room absorbs it. No one speaks afterward. Not immediately. Because numbers like that do not leave space for interpretation. They leave space only for acceptance. The defense attempts one final angle. Contamination. Time degradation. Procedural error. But even they sound less certain now. Because the foundation they are building on is no longer stable. It is eroding under the weight of consistency. When the court takes a recess, the hallway outside becomes chaotic. Reporters cluster. Voices overlap. Words like breakthrough, confession, and life sentence appear in fragments. But inside the defendant's holding area, there's only silence again. He sits alone. Hands folded. Eyes lowered. Not praying. Not reflecting. Just waiting. As if time itself has become something he has already outlived. Investigators observe him during transport between sessions. They note the same thing repeatedly. No visible panique. No emotionelles que laschen. Only control. And control in cases like this becomes its own kind of language. Back in court, testimony resumes. This time, more personal. Friends of the victim. People who describe who she was before she disappeared. Her routines. Her habits. Her consistency. They speak not to the crime, but to the absence it created. The courtroom shifts again. Emotion rises where evidence cannot. And for the first time, the defendant looks down for longer than usual. A subtle change. Barely visible. But noted. Always noted. As the day ends, the judge calls for order. The case is not concluded. Far from it. But something irreversible has already happened. The cold case is no longer cold. It is active. It is breathing. It is moving toward resolution, whether anyone is ready or not. Outside, the California sun feels unchanged. But everything beneath it is different now. A case once sealed in silence has been forced open. And what spills out is not just evidence. Not just suspicion. But time itself returning to demand explanation. And somewhere in that return, the truth is still forming. Slowly. Unwillingly. As if even now, after all these years, it is not ready to be fully seen. The fourth day feels different before anything is even said. There is a tension in the courthouse hallways, not loud, not visible, but embedded in every movement. Reporters speak in shorter sentences. Officers avoid eye contact. Even the usual rhythm of procedural routine feels disrupted, as if everyone involved understands that something is approaching a point of no return. Inside the courtroom, the defendant is already seated. Same posture, same composure, same controlled stillness that has become almost unsettling in its consistency. But today, the prosecution does not begin with evidence. They begin with silence. A long pause after the judge calls the court to order, a pause that stretches just long enough for the room to feel it. Then, slowly, a new set of materials is introduced. Not DNA. Not timelines. Not witnesses. But photographs. The victim's apartment is shown again, but this time from angles not previously emphasized. Close-ups. Details. The glass on the counter. The chair slightly displaced. The hallway light casting its uneven glow. Ordinary objects turned into permanent evidence. The prosecutor does not rush. Each image is allowed to breathe. Each image is allowed to linger. And in that lingering, something shifts in the courtroom atmosphere. Because repetition does not weaken these details. It strengthens them. Every viewing adds weight instead of reducing it. The defendant watches without movement. No visible reaction. No shift in expression. But his eyes follow each image more precisely now. Not drifting. Not detached. Focused in a way that suggests recognition without admission. Then the prosecution changes direction. They introduce something unexpected. Not forensic. Not physical. Behavioral reconstruction. A psychological map of the days leading up to the disappearance. They describe her routine with precision. Not just where she went, but when she went, how predictable she was, how structured her life had been. Predictability, they argue, is not just background detail. It is vulnerability. The word hangs in the room longer than expected. The defense objects immediately. Speculation, narrative framing, emotional manipulation. But the judge allows it to continue. Because the case is no longer only about what was found. It is about what was understood too late. The prosecution continues. They begin to outline a pattern that had never been fully recognized during the original investigation. A presence near the building. Not constant, not obvious, but repeated enough to be statistically significant in hindsight. A figure who appeared at different times of day. Never interacting. Never interfering. Just observing. The courtroom grows quieter. Because observation without action feels more deliberate than random encounter. The prosecution then presents something that changes the tone again. A timeline discrepancy that was never resolved in 2003. Phone records. Not calls made by the victim, but activity in the area during the critical window. Signals that placed a device near the location at a time that aligns too precisely with the disappearance to be ignored. The defense attempts to challenge interpretation. But the data is not emotional. It is structural. And structure is difficult to dismantle once it is fully assembled. The defendant shifts slightly in his seat for the first time. A minimal movement. Not enough for certainty, but enough for attention. The prosecution notices. They do not comment on it. They continue. They introduce a new witness. A forensic mapping specialist. Their job is not to speak about people, but about space. They reconstruct the environment around the apartment. Entry points, sightlines, movement possibilities, distance calculations. The courtroom watches as a 2003 neighborhood becomes a three-dimensional system of probabilities. Every street corner becomes a decision point. Every shadow becomes potential observation. Every route becomes meaningful. And within that reconstruction, one thing becomes increasingly clear. The perpetrator did not need force. The environment itself allowed proximity. The defense stands again. They argue that proximity is not proof. That observation is not action. That presence does not equal responsibility. But the words feel thinner now. Because they are no longer countering isolated claims. They are countering a system of connected patterns. Then the prosecution introduces something more difficult to dismiss. A behavioral timeline of the suspect himself. His routines in 2003. Where he worked. Where he lived. When he moved. When he was absent. They align his movements with the victim's final known day. And where those lines overlap, silence forms again in the courtroom. Not dramatic silence. Not emotional silence. But analytical silence. The kind that forms when coincidence becomes mathematically uncomfortable. The defendant's expression remains steady. But his hands are now clasped tighter than before. Not dramatically. Just enough to register. The prosecution pauses. Then delivers something unexpected. Not accusation. Not inference. But a question reconstructed from the past. Why did he speak to investigators in 2003? The courtroom shifts. Because this is not evidence. This is reversal. The prosecution revisits the original interview, the moment he had been questioned during the early stages of the disappearance. They play fragments of notes. Not audio, but recollections from officers involved. He had answered calmly then too. No suspicion attached. No follow-up required. He had been allowed to leave. And that decision now sits heavily over everything. Because in hindsight, the most dangerous moment in the case was not the disappearance itself. It was the moment he was not stopped. The defense tries to interrupt the narrative. But the jury is already following it. Because it reframes everything. Not as failure of evidence. But failure of recognition. The prosecution does not accuse the investigators. They simply present the timeline. And the timeline speaks for itself. The defendant is now being viewed not just as a suspect in isolation, but as someone who existed inside the system unnoticed. For 16 years. The weight of that realization spreads through the courtroom slowly. No dramatic reaction. Just gradual understanding. Then the prosecution shifts again. They return to the victim. Not as evidence, but as person. They describe her final confirmed moments once more, not to repeat, but to anchor the emotional reality of what was lost. The simplicity of her last evening. The ordinary nature of her routine. The absence of anything unusual. Ordinary becomes tragic in retrospect. Because nothing about that night warned of what was coming. The defendant finally looks up during this segment. Not at the prosecution. Not at the jury. At the floor in front of him. A shift so subtle it almost goes unnoticed. But it is the first break in his otherwise constant engagement pattern. The prosecution continues. They introduce something that was not available in 2003. Technology that did not exist at the time of the original investigation. Modern analysis of old data. Reinterpretation of overlooked traces. Digital reconstruction of movement patterns. What once seemed fragmented now forms continuity. The defense attempts one final push. They argue that time has distorted perception. That hindsight creates patterns that did not exist in reality. That reconstruction is not proof. But their tone has changed. Less confident. More defensive. Because the accumulation of detail has reached a point where opposition requires more than logic. It requires certainty of alternative explanation. And that certainty is no longer present. The day ends without resolution. No verdict. No conclusion. only continuation. But something irreversible has happened. The case is no longer defined by uncertainty. It is defined by convergence. Multiple independent elements pointing in the same direction, without fully naming it yet. Outside the courthouse, the air feels unchanged. But inside, everything has shifted. Because cold cases do not crack in a single moment. They fracture, gradually. And today another layer has broken away. Revealing not the end, but the structure beneath it. Still incomplete. Still unfolding. Still moving towards something that cannot be avoided forever. By the fifth session, the silence in the courtroom is no longer empty. It is loaded. Not with noise, not with chaos, but with expectation so dense it feels physical. Every chair seems heavier, every breath slower, every movement measured, as if even the smallest sound might disturb something already on the edge of breaking. The defendant is brought in at the same time as always. Same posture, same control, same unreadable expression that has become its own kind of language over the course of the trial. But something has changed in how people look at him now. Not curiosity. Not speculation. Recognition layered with unease. Because patterns, once fully exposed, cannot be unseen. The prosecution begins without introduction. No framing. No transition. Just a single photograph placed onto the screen. It is not the apartment this time. It is a map. A reconstruction of the neighborhood in 2003. Streets, buildings, walking distances, sight lines. The victim's apartment marked clearly, a second point highlighted nearby. The defendant's residence at the time. The distance is short. Too short. The prosecutor does not speak immediately. They allow the jury to absorb the spatial reality first. Not theory, not argument, just geography. Then comes the voice. Measured, controlled, certain. They describe the overlap. The proximity that made visibility unavoidable. They describe timing patterns reconstructed from work records, witness accounts, and phone activity. Not isolated pieces, but overlapping systems that converge around the night of the disappearance. The word converge is repeated. Not for emphasis, but for inevitability. Because this is no longer a scattered investigation. It is a narrowing corridor. The defense stands quickly. Objection. Interpretation. Assumption. Retrospective bias. But the judge waves it forward. And the corridor continues to narrow. The prosecution introduces something new. A behavioral expert. Not to diagnose, but to interpret patterns. They speak carefully, avoiding certainty where none is scientifically justified. But their analysis builds a framework that is difficult to ignore. Routine observation. Environmental familiarity. Predictive targeting behavior. Each phrase is clinical, detached, stripped of emotion. Yet together they form something unsettling. A structure that suggests intentional awareness of opportunity. The defendant remains still. But his jaw tightens slightly. Not enough to be dramatic. Enough to be noticed. The jury watches closely now. Every detail of his reaction has become evidence in itself, even when it is not formally presented as such. The prosecution continues. They bring forward a reconstructed timeline of the victim's final 3 hours. Not speculation. Not guesswork. But synthesis of known data points. Her phone activity. Her last confirmed movements. Her return home. Then the gap begins. The gap where nothing is recorded. Where silence begins to function as its own form of evidence. The prosecutor describes that gap as if it is an active space. Not absence. But transition. A moment where something shifted from ordinary life into irreversible disappearance. The courtroom feels it again. That same pressure from earlier sessions, but now sharper, more focused, less abstract. Because repetition has transformed uncertainty into familiarity. And familiarity makes patterns harder to dismiss. The defense attempts to reframe. They argue that gaps in data are not proof of action, That absence of evidence cannot be transformed into evidence of presence. But the argument feels weaker now. Less structured. More reactive. The prosecution responds not with confrontation, but with expansion. They introduce previously unconnected witness statements. Individuals who have been interviewed in 2003, but whose testimonies have been considered too vague to pursue further. Now reinterpreted under new context. A man seen near the building at unusual hours. A figure standing still too long. A presence noticed, but not reported with urgency at the time. Each statement alone is insignificant. Together, they begin to align. The defendant shifts slightly in his seat. Again. Subtle. Controlled. But no longer entirely still. The prosecution notices. They do not pause. They continue forward. They introduce forensic reanalysis. Not new evidence, but new interpretation of old material. Trace elements previously dismissed as inconclusive are now re-examined using updated methodology. The results do not produce direct identification, but they increase consistency with the suspect's known profile. Consistency becomes the key word. Not certainty. Not conclusion. But alignment across multiple independent datasets. The courtroom grows quieter with each layer added. Not because of shock, but because of accumulation. The kind of accumulation that does not require dramatic revelation to become overwhelming. The defense makes one final effort to challenge the foundation. They argue contamination possibilities again. They question procedural integrity of evidence storage over 16 years. They suggest that time itself has degraded reliability. But even as they speak, their tone lacks conviction. Because they are no longer arguing against one piece of evidence. They are arguing against convergence. And convergence is harder to dismantle than any single claim. The prosecution pauses again. A long pause. Then shifts tone. Slightly. Not emotionally, but structurally. They introduce something that changes the nature of the case once more. Not forensic. Not behavioral. But procedural history. They revisit the original 2003 investigation. Step by step. Not to criticize, but to reconstruct missed opportunities. The moment the defendant was interviewed. The decision not to detain. The absence of follow-up. The closure of suspicion too early. The courtroom shifts subtly. Because this is no longer just about what happened to the victim. It is about what did not happen when it could have. The weight of that realization is different. It is not accusatory. It is reflective. And reflection, in a courtroom, carries its own kind of tension. The defendant listens. Still composed. Still controlled. But something in his posture changes slightly. A minimal adjustment in how he holds himself. As if the narrative is now surrounding him more completely than before. The prosecution then returns to the victim again. But differently this time. Not timeline. Not evidence. But presence. Who she was. How ordinary her final evening had been. How unremarkable her last confirmed actions were. The point is not emotion. The point is contrast. Between normality and disappearance. Between routine and rupture. The jury is reminded not just of what is being investigated, but what was lost. The defendant finally looks directly forward for an extended moment. Longer than before. But still without expression. Still without reaction that can be clearly categorized. Then he looks away again. The prosecution does not comment. They do not need to. Because the structure of the case is now self-sustaining. Each element reinforces another. Each piece of testimony connects to a larger framework that no longer depends on any single point of failure. The defense sits down slowly after their final objection of the day. The energy in their argument has diminished. Not collapse, but exhaustion. The recognition that the case has shifted beyond early-stage uncertainty. The judge calls for a recess. But the courtroom does not fully reset. Nothing resets anymore. In the hallway, conversations are lower. Reporters no longer ask open questions. They ask variations of the same one. How close are we to resolution? Inside the holding area, the defendant sits alone again. Same posture. Same stillness. But now that stillness feels different. Not control alone, but containment. As if everything being said in court is pressing inward, tightening around a center that has not yet been fully exposed. Investigators outside continue working. Rechecking timelines. Revalidating evidence chains. Expanding geographical mapping. Not because doubt remains, but because confirmation requires completeness. And completeness has not yet been achieved. By the time court adjourns, no new conclusion has been reached. But the trajectory has become unmistakable. The case is no longer moving sideways. It is moving inward. Toward a point that has not yet been spoken aloud in full, but is already beginning to take shape in every reconstruction, every testimony, every measured silence between words. And somewhere beneath all of it, unchanged since 2003, the original absence still exists. Waiting. Not to be discovered, but to be fully understood. By the sixth session, the case no longer feels like it is being presented. It feels like it is being revealed layer by layer, as if time itself is being peeled back inside the courtroom. There is a different kind of silence now. Not anticipation, not tension alone, but fatigue mixed with inevitability. The kind of silence that forms when people stop expecting surprises and start expecting confirmation. The defendant is already there when the session begins. Same seat, same posture, same controlled stillness. But now even that stillness has started to look less like strength and more like containment. As if something inside has been compressed for too long. The prosecution does not waste time with introduction. They begin with a new sequence of evidence. Digital reconstruction. The screen changes. Maps appear again, but this time more detailed, layered with modern analysis tools that did not exist in 2003. Heat maps of movement probability. Signal reconstructions. Behavioral overlays. The courtroom leans in almost instinctively. Because this is not speculation. It is synthesis. The prosecutor explains carefully. They are not claiming to recreate the exact moment of disappearance. They are showing what data now suggests was most likely given all known variables. And those variables align in a way that is increasingly difficult to dismiss. The victim's last known movements are placed on the timeline again. Then the defendant's. Two separate paths. Until they begin to converge. The convergence point is marked. A narrow window of time. Short, precise, unforgiving. The prosecution lets the image stay on screen longer than necessary. Not to dramatize, but to force absorption. Because once seen, the overlap cannot be unseen. The defense rises immediately. They argue that reconstructed probability is not fact. That modern modeling applied to old data introduces bias. That visual overlays create illusions of certainty where none existed in original investigation. The judge allows the argument. But the jury does not look convinced. Because something else has changed over the course of this trial. It is not just the evidence. It is accumulation. The kind that builds pressure through repetition. The prosecution continues. They introduce phone metadata analysis. Not content. Not calls. But signals. Movement-based triangulation reconstructed from archived network logs. The courtroom shifts again. Because now the case is no longer anchored only in witness memory or physical evidence. It is anchored in systems that existed independently of human recollection. The prosecutor explains calmly. The victim's phone activity ceases at a specific time window. Within that same window, a separate device registered in proximity patterns consistent with the defendant's known location history. Not direct connection, but spatial overlap. And in forensic reconstruction, overlap is often the first sign of interaction. The defendant adjusts slightly in his seat. A subtle shift of weight. Barely noticeable. But no longer isolated. Because similar micromovements have begun appearing more frequently during technical testimony. The defense notices. They attempt to redirect focus. They question reliability of historical network reconstruction. They emphasize margin of error. They attempt to reintroduce uncertainty into systems that appear increasingly precise. But the tone is different now. Less assertive. More defensive. As if they are trying to slow momentum rather than reverse it. The prosecution then introduces something that changes the atmosphere again. A revisit to the original crime scene photographs. But not the ones shown earlier. These are enhanced analyses. New interpretations of old images. Light angle reconstruction. Object displacement modeling. Spatial inference based on updated forensic methodology. The apartment appears again on screen. Still. Frozen. The glass, the chair, the hallway light. But now each object is overlaid with analytical markers. Not emotional symbols. Functional indicators. Probabilities of interaction. Movement vectors. The courtroom watches in near silence. Because what once looked like static imagery now appears dynamic under analysis. The prosecution explains that while no forced entry was detected, internal movement patterns suggest controlled presence inside the space. Not intrusion. Transition. The defense objects again. But the objection feels procedural rather than strategic. Because the argument is no longer about whether something happened. It is about how it is being interpreted. And interpretation has begun to converge. The judge allows continuation. The prosecution then introduces witness testimony that had been previously dismissed as too inconsistent. A neighbor who had reported hearing movement inside the building at an unusual hour. A sound described as not urgent, but deliberate. At the time, it was not considered significant. Now, placed within reconstructed timeline, it becomes part of a sequence. Another piece aligning into position. The courtroom is no longer reacting to individual statements. It is reacting to pattern formation. The defendant sits still again. But now his hands are no longer resting loosely. They are clasped. Fingers interlocked. Not visibly tense. But no longer relaxed. The prosecution notices, but does not comment. They move forward. They introduce something that has been building quietly across previous sessions, but is now made explicit. Behavioral consistency across time. They explain that despite lack of prior violent record, the defendant's documented behavioral patterns show sustained ability to maintain dual presence, normal social functioning alongside extended periods of unexplained activity gaps. Not proof of crime, but compatibility with opportunity structure. The phrase lands heavily. Compatibility with opportunity. Not accusation, but alignment. The defense responds quickly. They argue that behavioral compatibility is not evidence, that it risks turning personality traits into suspicion frameworks. But their words are starting to lose impact. Because the prosecution is no longer relying on interpretation alone. They are layering systems. Each system reinforcing the others. The prosecution pauses again. Then shifts tone. They bring up the original investigative timeline once more. But this time, not as critique. As reconstruction of missed convergence. They show how early evidence was separated into isolated categories. Witness statements here. Physical evidence there. Behavioral notes elsewhere. Never integrated. Never connected. Until now. The courtroom feels that shift. Because integration changes everything. The defendant looks down for a longer period than before. Not dramatically, but noticeably. The prosecution continues. They present a reconstructed model of investigative decision points. Moments where different choices could have altered trajectory. Each point is displayed without emotional framing. Just structure. Just sequence. But the implication is unavoidable. The case was always closer to resolution than anyone realized. It was just fragmented. The defense attempts one final push. They argue that reconstruction creates false certainty, that hindsight organizes randomness into patterns that may not reflect reality. But even as they speak, the jury appears less responsive, because doubt requires space to grow, and space has been steadily reduced over 6 sessions. The prosecution then returns to the victim, but this time, not even as narrative, as absence. They describe what is no longer present, not to evoke emotion, but to anchor consequence. A life interrupted without warning, a routine permanently halted, a space in time that has never been restored. The courtroom is quiet now, not emotionally charged, but structurally still, as if the system itself is pausing before final alignment. The defendant remains motionless for several seconds, then exhales. A controlled breath, but deeper than previous ones. The only visible sign that pressure is accumulating internally. The judge calls for recess again, but no one moves quickly, because the atmosphere has changed. The case is no longer fragmented arguments presented across days. It is a single system approaching completion. Outside, the media narrative intensifies. But inside the courtroom, narrative no longer matters. Only structure remains. And that structure is tightening. Investigators continue working in parallel, reanalyzing overlooked details, confirming overlaps, eliminating inconsistencies, not searching for new suspects, but refining the profile of the existing one. By the end of the day, no new evidence has been introduced that stands alone. But everything introduced so far has begun to lock together, like pieces forming a mechanism that now moves in only one direction, toward conclusion. Not yet declared, but already forming. And in that formation, the cold case is no longer cold. It is active. It is converging. And it is closing in on a truth that has waited 16 years to be fully seen. By the 7th session, something subtle but irreversible has taken hold. The courtroom no longer feels like a place where arguments are being tested. It feels like a place where resistance is slowly dissolving. Not loudly, not dramatically, but through accumulation, through repetition, through the quiet persistence of detail that no longer leaves space for escape. The defendant enters as he always does. Measured steps, neutral expression, hands steady. But the room reacts differently now. Not outwardly. No whispers, no visible tensión. Just a shift in attention. Every eye tracks him. Not with curiosity anymore. With expectation. Because by now, everyone understands that whatever remains unsaid is what matters most. The prosecution begins without delay. No build-up, no introduction. Just a single line. We are going to revisit the night. The words land harder than any piece of evidence so far. Because the night has already been revisited. Multiple times. From multiple angles. But today feels different. Because this is no longer about reconstruction. It is about compression. They bring the timeline back again. But this time, there are no gaps. Or at least no visible ones. Each minute is accounted for. Not with certainty in isolation, but with alignment across systems. Witness fragments. Phone data. Movement reconstruction. Behavioral consistency. Individually incomplete. Together continuous. The courtroom feels the difference immediately. Because continuity removes distance. And distance is what doubt depends on. The prosecution walks slowly through the sequence. Her arrival home. The last confirmed activity. The moment routine ends. Then transition. They do not speculate. They do not dramatize. They simply state. A controlled entry. A brief interaction. A removal. The words are clinical. But the impact is not. The defense stands quickly. Objection. Speculative narrative. The judge allows partial continuation. Not as fact. But as interpretive framework. And that is enough. Because the framework is now supported by everything that came before it. The defendant watches the timeline unfold. Still. But not as still as before. His eyes move more frequently now. Tracking details. Reacting in microseconds. The kind of reactions that cannot be fully controlled once pressure builds over time. The prosecution notices. They adjust pace. Slightly slower. Allowing each element to settle. Then they introduce something that has not yet been fully explored. Time after disappearance. Not the moment she vanished. But what followed. Because disappearance is only the beginning. What comes after is where behavior reveals itself. They present a reconstruction of the defendant's movements in the hours following the critical window. Inconsistent gaps. Unexplained absences. Routes that deviate from routine. Not dramatically. Not enough to trigger suspicion in 2003. But now enough to matter. The defense challenges immediately. Coincidence. Routine variation. Memory distortion over time. But their objections feel increasingly procedural. Because the narrative has shifted beyond individual claims. It is now systemic. The prosecution continues. They introduce environmental analysis. Not just where he could have gone, but where he did not go. Routes avoided. Locations bypassed. Patterns of movement that suggest awareness of observation zones. The courtroom grows quieter again. Because absence of movement can be as revealing as movement itself. The defendant shifts again. A small adjustment. A repositioning of hands. Nothing overt. But no longer invisible. The prosecution then pauses. Longer than before. Then speaks in a different tone. Not louder. But more direct. You were there. The words are not framed as question. They are placed. Carefully. Deliberately. The defense objects. The judge sustains partially. But the moment has already landed. Because even sustained objections cannot erase what has already been heard. The prosecution moves forward. They introduce an expert in behavioral response under sustained questioning. Not to analyze the defendant directly, but to explain patterns of reaction. Micro-expressions. Delayed responses. Involuntary corrections. The expert speaks calmly. Neutral language. But the implications are clear. Sustained pressure reveals inconsistency. Not through confession, but through deviation from baseline behavior. The jury listens closely. Because by now, they have observed the defendant for days. They have a baseline. And now they are being shown how to measure deviation. The defense attempts to challenge the relevance. They argue that interpretation of behavior is subjective. That courtroom observation is not scientific measurement. But the argument feels less effective. Because the jury has already been watching. Already been noticing. Already forming impressions. The prosecution does not need to convince them to look. Only to understand what they're seeing. Then comes a moment no one expected. The prosecution plays back excerpts from the 2003 interview again. But this time, not as record. As comparison. They juxtapose past responses with present ones. Similar phrasing. Similar pauses. Similar avoidance patterns. The courtroom feels the shift immediately. Because time has not changed his behavior. It has preserved it. The defendant looks up briefly during this segment. For a second too long. Then looks down again. The first visible break in control that cannot be dismissed as random. The prosecution continues without pause. They introduce statistical analysis of coincidence probability across all presented elements. Not emotional argument. Not narrative. Numbers. Cold. Unforgiving. The likelihood of all independent factors aligning by chance. The figure is spoken clearly. Slowly. Once. No repetition. Because it does not need to be repeated. The courtroom absorbs it. Silence follows. Longer than usual. Even the defense does not immediately respond. Because numbers do not invite debate the way words do. They sit. They settle. They persist. The prosecution then returns to the victim again. But this time differently. Not as presence. Not as absence. But as center. Everything presented so far leads back to that moment. That space. That disappearance. They reconstruct the final known environment once more. But now, there is no ambiguity. Only convergence. The defendant's posture changes slightly. He leans back further than before. Not in relaxation. In distance. As if creating space between himself and what is being said. But the space does not exist. Not anymore. The prosecution ends the session with something simple. No dramatic conclusion. No emotional appeal. Just a statement. All elements now align. The words are quiet. But they carry more weight than anything that came before. Because alignment is not accusation. It is structure. And structure, once complete, does not require reinforcement. The judge calls for adjournment. But the room does not move immediately. Because something has shifted again. Not externally. Internally. The case no longer feels unresolved. It feels inevitable. Outside, the narrative is already changing. Reporters speak in terms of outcome rather than possibility. Speculation is fading. Conclusion is approaching. Inside, the defendant is let out. Same pace. Same silence. But no longer invisible. Because now every movement is being interpreted. Every pause is being measured. Every breath is part of something larger. And somewhere within that structure, the truth is no longer hiding. It is waiting. For the final moment when it can no longer remain unspoken. By the 8th session, the courtroom no longer belongs to argument. It belongs to consequence. There is no rush now, no urgency to convince. The weight is already settled, and everything that follows feels like movement within something that has already taken shape. The defendant is brought in under the same procedures, but nothing feels routine anymore. Even the sound of the door closing behind him carries a different resonance. He takes his seat. Same posture. Same control. But now that control feels strained. Not visibly broken. But under pressure. As if something inside has begun to shift, slowly, inevitably toward collapse. The prosecution begins in silence. Not intentional delay. But recognition. Recognition that words are no longer needed to create tension. Because tension already exists. They move forward with a different approach. No new evidence at first. Instead, they begin to connect everything presented so far into a single continuous structure. They revisit the convergence. Not piece by piece. But as a system. The map. The timeline. The behavioral patterns. The phone data. The witness fragments. The forensic reanalysis. Each element is placed back into position, not as isolated facts, but as components of a single mechanism. The courtroom watches as the structure rebuilds itself in real time. Faster now. More fluid. Because repetition has removed hesitation. The prosecution does not argue. They assemble. And assembly is more powerful than persuasion when a piece is already fit. The defense remains seated longer than usual. No immediate objection. No interruption. Because there is nothing new to challenge. Only reinforcement of what has already been established. The defendant watches. But differently. His gaze no longer tracks every detail. It drifts. Returns. Drifts again. The first clear sign that sustained control is becoming difficult. The prosecution notices. They do not accelerate. They slow slightly. allowing each connection to settle deeper. Then they introduce something new. Not evidence. Not testimony. But sequence. A continuous narrative built entirely from established facts. No speculation. No assumption. Only what has already been presented. They begin at the last confirmed moment. Her return home. They move through the convergence window. They outline the overlap. They describe the transition. Then they continue. Beyond the disappearance. Into what followed. The defendant shifts. More noticeably now. A slight repositioning of his shoulders. A breath drawn deeper than before. The prosecution continues. They describe post-event behavior. Movement patterns. Activity gaps. Absences that align with opportunity. Not as accusation, but as continuation of sequence. The courtroom feels the difference. Because sequence removes fragmentation. And fragmentation is what allows doubt to exist. The defense stands. Finally, they object to narrative framing. They argue that reconstruction is being presented as fact. The judge allows partial adjustment. But the sequence remains. Because it is built entirely from admitted elements. The prosecution does not need to defend it. It defends itself. The defendant's hands are no longer still. Fingers move slightly. Not fidgeting. But no longer fixed. The smallest visible erosion of control. The prosecution pauses. Then introduces the next phase. Aftermath. They focus on what did not happen. No report. No follow-up. No attempt to re-engage with investigators beyond initial interview. Silence maintained for 16 years. The word silence returns. But now it carries different weight. Not absence. But decision. The defense objects again. They argue that silence cannot be interpreted as guilt. The judge acknowledges. But allows continuation within limits. Because silence, when placed within structure, becomes part of context. The prosecution continues. They present data on behavioral consistency over long-term concealment. Not specific to this case. But general. Patterns observed in individuals who maintain undisclosed actions over extended periods. Control. Routine reinforcement. Avoidance of disruption. The courtroom listens. Because this is no longer about the event alone. It is about endurance. 16 years of it. The defendant looks down. Longer than before. His breathing is now visibly different. Still controlled. But heavier. As if each breath requires more effort. The prosecution does not acknowledge it. They move forward. They introduce something subtle. Language analysis. Comparison between his statements in 2003 and current responses. Word choice. Sentence structure. Avoidance patterns. The expert explains without emphasis. But the alignment is clear. Consistency in deflection. Consistency in partial acknowledgement without completion. The defense attempts to challenge interpretation. But their argument feels fragmented. Disconnected. Because they are responding to multiple layers simultaneously. The prosecution then does something unexpected. They stop. No immediate continuation. No new material. Just silence. The courtroom sits in it. Longer than any previous pause. Because now silence is no longer absence. It is pressure. The defendant shifts again. A visible exhale. His shoulders drop slightly. Not collapse. But release. Temporary. Involuntary. The prosecution resumes. Final phase of the session. They bring everything back to center. The victim. Not as memory. Not as evidence. But as fixed point. Everything converges here. Every pattern. every movement, every absence, leads back to that moment, that space, that disappearance. The courtroom feels it again, but differently. Not as shock, as inevitability. The defense does not object. Not immediately, because there is nothing new to interrupt. Only culmination. The prosecution ends with a statement. Simple. Measured. Nothing stands alone anymore. The words settle slowly, because they define the entire case. Not individual evidence, but connection. Not fragments, but structure. The judge calls for adjournment, but no one moves right away, because something has shifted again. Not visibly, but internally. The case has crossed a threshold, from presentation to conclusion. Not formally, but functionally. Outside, the narrative has already changed. Reporters no longer ask if, they ask when. Inside, the defendant is escorted out. Same pace. Same silence. But not the same presence. Because now, his silence is no longer neutral. It is interpreted. Measured. Placed within a system that no longer allows ambiguity to exist freely. Investigators continue working. Final checks. Final confirmations. Not searching for new directions, but ensuring no gaps remain. Because the system is almost complete. And once complete, it cannot be undone. And somewhere within that structure, the truth is no longer hidden. It is contained. Waiting only for the moment when containment is no longer possible. By the 9th session, the atmosphere in the courtroom has changed shape entirely. It no longer feels like a trial moving toward a verdict. It feels like a system closing around a fixed point. Not tightening suddenly, but gradually. Mechanically. Like something inevitable that was always in motion, even when no one could see it. The defendant is brought in as before. Same entrance, same pace, same controlled posture. But now, even the way he walks feels slightly different to those watching closely. Not weaker. Not slower. But more deliberate. As if each step is being measured against something unseen. He takes his seat. The prosecution does not begin immediately. They allow the silence to sit. Not empty silence. Structured silence. The kind that forces attention inward. The jury does not look away. Not anymore. Because by now, attention has become habit. And habit has become expectation. The prosecution finally speaks. But not with evidence. With acknowledgement. They say something simple. Something that changes the tone of everything that follows. We are no longer establishing connection. A pause. We are confirming it. The words land differently than anything before them. Because confirmation is not an argument. It is acceptance of structure already formed. The defense reacts immediately. Standing. Objecting. Framing the statement as prejudicial, as narrative overreach. But the judge only partially engages. Allowing the trial to continue within procedural boundaries already stretched thin by accumulation. The prosecution does not escalate. They proceed. They introduce what they call a consolidated evidentiary map. Not new material, but a full integration of everything previously presented. For the first time, the courtroom sees the case not as separate exhibits, but as a single interconnected system. The victim's timeline. The defendant's movements. The spatial overlap. The behavioral analysis. The forensic reinterpretations. The witness fragments. The digital reconstructions. All layered together. Not sequentially, but simultaneously. The effect is immediate. Because separation had been the last remaining defense against certainty. And separation is gone. The map fills the screen. Lines converge. Paths intersect. Time windows collapse into narrow corridors of overlap. The prosecution does not speak for several seconds, letting the structure exist on its own, letting the jury absorb it without interruption. The defendant looks at the screen, longer than before, not at individual elements, but at the whole. That is new. Because before, he had tracked details. Now he is confronted with totality. The defense attempts to object again. But the argument is weaker now. Not in content, but in timing. Because objection requires something to interrupt. And nothing in the map is new. It is only combined. The prosecution resumes. They begin walking the courtroom through the integrated model. Slowly. Deliberately. Not explaining each part again, but explaining relationships between parts. How one element reinforces another. How gaps disappear when viewed collectively. How uncertainty reduces when systems align. The phrase system alignment is repeated. Not as rhetoric, but as description. The defendant shifts in his seat. More noticeably now. A slight lean forward. Then back. Then stillness again. The first visible cycle of internal pressure. The prosecution introduces a new concept. Cumulative probability. Not of individual events, but of combined consistency. They explain that while each piece of evidence alone may not reach certainty, their combined alignment produces a convergence point that cannot be reasonably explained by coincidence. The number is presented. Once. No repetition. Because repetition is no longer necessary. The courtroom absorbs it in silence. The defense does not immediately respond. That delay is new. It signals recalibration. Not confidence. Reassessment. The prosecution then shifts focus again. They revisit the 2003 interview. But differently. This time, it is not comparison. It is recontextualization. They show how initial investigative closure was based on fragmentation. Isolated observations. Limited data integration. They show how, at the time, no system existed to connect these elements effectively. And therefore, the defendant was never fully evaluated within a complete structure. The implication is clear without being stated. The case was always there. It was just invisible in its original form. The defendant's gaze drops. Longer than before. His hands now rest closer together. Fingers interlocked. Not tense, but contained. The prosecution continues. They introduce behavioral endurance modeling. Not to speculate about intent, but to demonstrate capacity. The ability of individuals to maintain consistency over long periods under low external pressure. 16 years. The number is spoken without emphasis. But it echoes. Because duration has become part of the evidence structure itself. The defense finally responds. But differently now. Less procedural. More conceptual. They argue that long-term behavioral modeling risks retroactive interpretation bias. That time compresses randomness into patterns that may not have existed in real time. But their argument lacks earlier force. Because the prosecution is no longer building isolated claims. They are presenting interconnected inevitability. The judge allows continuation. The prosecution then pauses. Longer than usual. The room feels it immediately. Because pauses now carry meaning. They are not absence. They are transition points. The prosecution then speaks again. This time, slower. More direct. They say they are not asking the jury to infer intent. They are asking the jury to evaluate convergence. The word returns again. Convergence. But now it is not descriptive. It is definitional. They replay the integrated map once more. But now without commentary. The courtroom watches in silence. The defendant does not move for several seconds. Then he leans back. Slowly. controlled, but no longer fully still. The first visible surrender of posture stability. The prosecution then introduces something unexpected. Not evidence, not analysis, but absence of contradiction. They explain that across all sessions, across all presented data, there has been no alternative explanation that accounts for all variables simultaneously. Not partial explanations. Not competing theories. A complete alternative structure. There is silence. Because this is not accusation. It is elimination of alternatives. The defense attempts to respond. But their tone has changed again. More restrained. Less certain. They argue that absence of alternative does not equal confirmation. But even they seem aware that the argument now operates within narrowing space. The prosecution does not push further. They do not need to. Because the structure now holds on its own. The jury is watching the defendant again. But differently. Not searching for reaction. But for contradiction. And finding less of it each time. The prosecution concludes the session by returning to a single point. Not the victim. Not the defendant. But the moment of disappearance. They frame it not as isolated event, but as structural pivot. The point at which all systems diverge and never reconnect. The courtroom feels that framing settle. Because it reframes everything. Not as past investigation, but as ongoing structure finally being resolved. The judge calls for adjournment. But again movement is slow. No one fully leaves the moment immediately. Because something has changed again. Not in evidence. But in certainty density. Outside, the media narrative has now fully shifted. Language is no longer speculative. It is declarative. Inside, the defendant is escorted out. Same route. Same pace. But no longer perceived as isolated individual. Now perceived as center of converging structure. And in that structure, there is less and less room for anything to remain undefined. Because convergence, once complete, does not expand. It closes. And the case is now closing with it. By the 10th session, the courtroom no longer feels like it is processing evidence. It feels like it is waiting for permission to end. There is a heaviness in the air that is no longer created by suspense or uncertainty, but by exhaustion layered over inevitability. 10 sessions of convergence, 10 layers of reconstruction, 10 iterations of the same truth viewed from different angles until even doubt has begun to lose structure. The defendant enters as before. But something about the room reacts differently now. Not dramatically. Not visibly. Just a subtle shift in attention density, as if every person present understands that what remains is no longer about discovery, but final alignment. He sits. Same chair. Same posture. But the stillness is no longer interpreted as control alone. It is interpreted as containment under conclusion pressure. The prosecution begins without preamble. They no longer build context. They no longer introduce frameworks. They begin with a single statement. All systems presented now align without contradiction. A pause. It is not theatrical. It is functional. Because the statement itself does not require elaboration. The defense stands immediately, objecting. But the objection is softer now. Less forceful. More procedural reflex than strategic interruption. The judge allows the proceedings to continue within established boundaries. And nothing changes the direction anymore. The prosecution introduces what they call the final integrated model. Not new evidence. Not additional testimony. But a complete compression of everything previously presented into a unified reconstruction. The screen changes. The map returns. But it is no longer segmented. It is fully layered. Time, space, movement, behavior, probability, all merged into a single interactive system. The victim's final known actions appear first. Then the convergence window. Then the defendant's location patterns. Then the reconstructed behavioral overlays. then the forensic reinterpretations, then witness confirmations, then environmental modeling. Each layer activates in sequence, but also simultaneously remains visible beneath the others. The effect is overwhelming in its simplicity, because complexity has been converted into structure, and structure has removed ambiguity. The prosecution does not speak for several seconds. They allow the model to exist without explanation, because explanation is no longer necessary. The jury watches in silence. Not confusion. Not debate. Absorption. The defendant looks at the screen longer than before. Not at individual elements, but at the total system. That is important, because earlier sessions showed him tracking details. Now he is confronted with the absence of separability. Everything is connected. Everything is dependent. Everything is contained within a single interpretive frame. The prosecution finally speaks. They walk the court through the system one final time. Not to explain, but to confirm understanding. They describe how each element reinforces the others. How removal of any single component does not collapse the structure, because redundancy exists across layers. This is no longer a fragile case built on isolated points. It is a reinforced network of alignment. The defense attempts to respond, but their argument has shifted again. Now it focuses almost entirely on epistemology, on the limits of interpretation, on the danger of retrospective coherence. They argue that systems built after the fact always appear more complete than reality ever was. But their voice lacks urgency, because urgency requires possibility of reversal, and reversal no longer exists within the presented structure. The prosecution does not interrupt. They let the argument finish. Then they introduce something unexpected. Not contradiction, but final absence. They state clearly that after exhaustive review, no alternate explanation accounts for all verified variables simultaneously. Not partially. Not statistically. Completely. The courtroom absorbs that without reaction, because it is not an emotional statement. It is structural elimination. The defendant shifts again. More noticeably now. He leans forward slightly, then stills, then exhales. The first visible sign that internal containment is no longer stable in the same way. The prosecution continues. They return to the 2003 investigation, but not as critique, as origin analysis. They show how initial investigative fragmentation created blind separation between data types, how behavioral signals were treated independently from forensic traces, how spatial proximity was not connected to temporal overlap, how witness uncertainty was not integrated into pattern recognition, and how, under those conditions, the system failed to see convergence. The implication is no longer subtle. The case was always solvable. It was only structurally incomplete. The defense does not interrupt. They listen. Because interruption now serves no strategic purpose. The prosecution then shifts tone slightly. Not emotionally, but directionally. They focus on inevitability, not of guilt, but of alignment. They argue that when independent systems converge repeatedly without contradiction, the probability of coincidence approaches functional impossibility. The number is referenced again. Not repeated. Just acknowledged. The courtroom already remembers it. The defense tries one final framing. They argue that convergence is not causation. That alignment is not action. That correlation does not equal responsibility. But even as they speak, their words feel increasingly isolated from the structure surrounding them. Because structure does not require interpretation once fully assembled. It simply exists. The prosecution pauses again. Longer than usual. The silence now feels different. Not tension, but transition. They then say something simple. We are now at the point of no further structural expansion. The phrase lands heavily, because it signals completion of development phase. What remains is only resolution. The jury looks toward the defendant again. But differently now. Not as individual, but as central node in completed system. The defendant does not react immediately. Then he looks down. Longer than before. Hands still clasped. But no longer tightly. Loosened. Not collapse. But release of sustained internal compression. The prosecution continues. They summarize. Not evidence, but structure. They list system components not as arguments, but as verified elements. Each one reinforcing the others. Each one dependent on the full model for meaning. By the end of the summary, there is no longer any separation between individual points. They exist only as collective configuration. The judge listens quietly. No interruption. No correction. Because correction is no longer relevant. Only acknowledgement of completion boundary. The defense sits down without further objection. Not surrender. But recognition that argument space is narrowed beyond functional utility. The prosecution then says something unexpected again. Not accusation. Not conclusion. But statement of closure phase initiation. They indicate that all evidentiary systems are now fully presented. That no additional structural elements remain unexamined. That the case has reached maximum interpretive density. The courtroom feels that phrase differently than all others. Because it does not point forward. It points inward. Toward something already formed. The judge calls for adjournment. But again, no one moves quickly. Because departure feels disconnected from conclusion. As if leaving before resolution would be incomplete participation. Outside, media language has fully transformed. There is no speculation anymore. Only anticipation of formal outcome. Inside, the defendant is escorted out. Same path. Same pace. But perception of him has changed completely. He is no longer being watched as suspect. He is being watched as center of finalized structure awaiting formal closure. And in that structure, nothing remains unaligned. Only one step remains. And it is no longer about discovery. It is about declaration. The final session does not begin like the others. There is no sense of build-up in the courtroom now. No l'air d'anticipation. No procedural rhythm that suggests continuation. Everything feels suspended at a threshold that has already been crossed in all but name. Even the silence is different. It is not waiting anymore. It is finalizing. The defendant is brought in as usual, but the atmosphere reacts to him differently now. Not with tension, not with curiosity, but with the quiet recognition that the system has already reached its conclusion internally, and what remains is only formal articulation. He sits. Same position. Same controlled stillness. But the stillness no longer reads as resistance. It reads as containment at its endpoint. The judge enters. Order is called. But no one in the room moves as if anything new is about to unfold. Because nothing new is expected. The prosecution stands, and for the first time in the entire process, they do not bring screens, maps, reconstructions, or layered evidence models. They bring only a single folder. No presentation. No visuals. No expansion. Just documentation. The prosecutor opens it slowly. Not theatrically. Deliberately. As if acknowledging that what is inside no longer requires interpretation. They begin to speak. But differently than before. Not building. Not layering. Not connecting. Confirming. They state that all evidentiary systems previously presented have reached full convergence. That every independent dataset, spatial, temporal, behavioral, forensic, and testimonial, has been exhaustively analyzed, cross-validated, and reintegrated. And that no contradiction remains across any verified system. The words are simple. But they land with final weight. The defense stands immediately. But this time, there is no urgency in the movement. Only formality. They begin to object. But even their objection sounds different now. Less like resistance. More like procedural closure. They argue due process. They argue interpretive overreach. They argue the limits of reconstruction. But the structure of the case no longer allows fragmentation. The judge listens. Quietly. Then signals for continuation. Because at this stage, interruption no longer alters trajectory. It only delays acknowledgement. The prosecution turns a page in the folder and reads. Not narrative. Not interpretation. But final evidentiary summary. They restate key findings. Not individually, but as unified structure. The victim's final confirmed timeline. The convergence window. The defendant's verified proximity patterns. The forensic DNA match with statistical certainty beyond disputed thresholds. The behavioral consistency across historical and present observation. The absence of any alternative explanation that accounts for all aligned variables simultaneously. Each element is stated once. No repetition. No emphasis. Because emphasis is no longer required. The structure itself carries it. The courtroom listens in absolute silence. Not because of shock, but because nothing remains to contest. The prosecution pauses after the final line. Longer than usual. Then they speak the words that have been structurally implied across every previous session, but never formally stated in this form. They request formal recognition of responsibility based on convergent evidentiary certainty. The phrase is not emotional. It is procedural. But it reshapes the room. Because procedural language, when applied at this level of convergence, becomes finality itself. The defense attempts one last response. But their voice is noticeably lower now. Not weakened in content alone, but in function. They argue that convergence does not eliminate uncertainty in absolute philosophical terms. That reconstruction always carries interpretive limits. But the argument no longer lands in opposition. It lands beside the structure, not against it. The judge looks down at the file. Long pause. Then looks at the jury. The jury does not move. Not because they are frozen, but because they are already aligned internally with the structure they have been shown across 11 sessions. No contradictions remain in their expressions. Only acknowledgement of completion pressure. The defendant sits still. For a long time. Longer than in any previous session. His hands are no longer tightly interlocked. They rest. Not relaxed. Not tense. But released into neutrality. And that neutrality is what draws attention now. Because neutrality after sustained structural pressure is no longer interpreted as ignorance. It is interpreted as endpoint behavior. The prosecution speaks again. Not adding anything new, but summarizing final structural state. They state that the case has reached complete evidentiary closure across all presented systems. That all relevant variables have been integrated into a unified model without unresolved discrepancy. And that the model no longer supports multiple interpretations. Only one coherent configuration remains. The victim. The timeline. The convergence window. The defendant. The alignment. The silence that followed. The system now exists without branching. Only continuation into conclusion. The judge finally speaks. Not at length. Not with elaboration. But with procedural clarity. They acknowledge that the court has received and reviewed all evidentiary presentations. That the jury has been presented with complete integrated findings. And that deliberation will proceed based on unified record. A final adjournment is called before deliberation. But no one in the courtroom moves quickly. Because movement now feels disconnected from resolution. As if leaving would interrupt a process already complete internally. Outside the courthouse, the atmosphere is no longer investigative. It is anticipatory. The language of uncertainty has disappeared from every report. What remains is outcome framing. Inside, the defendant is escorted out one final time. Same corridor. Same pace. But perception has fundamentally shifted. He is no longer being processed as suspect under evaluation. He is being transitioned as finalized subject of concluded evidentiary structure. And in that structure, there is no remaining gap. No undesalved variable. No alternative configuration waiting to emerge. Only the final step remains outside the courtroom. And that step is no longer about discovery. It is about acknowledgement. Because in cases like this, when every system converges without contradiction, silence is no longer uncertainty. It is closure waiting to be spoken aloud.